Right now, in a universe almost identical to this one, you are reading different words. In that world, perhaps a single raindrop fell 3 seconds later this morning, changing the timing of a traffic light, delaying a stranger just long enough that they missed bumping into someone who would have become the love of their life. That missed collision rippled forward, altering the existence of children who will never be born, inventions that will never be created, songs that will never be sung. This is not science fiction. This is mathematics made visible, the strange arithmetic of causation that governs every moment of existence. You live balanced on the edge of infinite possibility, where the smallest variations create entirely different realities. The butterfly effect isn't a metaphor, it's the secret architecture of everything you call real. The world you inhabit emerged from a chain of improbabilities so vast that its existence borders on impossible. Every breath you take represents the culmination of millions of precise circumstances, aligning across billions of years. The cosmic dice rolled exactly right for stars to form at the correct distance, for planets to cool at the perfect rate, for the first spark of life to ignite in precisely the right chemical soup. And then, across eons of evolution, countless tiny chances had to fall exactly as they did for consciousness to emerge, for your ancestors to survive, for the exact genetic combination that became you to manifest. But the miraculous precision goes deeper than cosmic history. It operates in the mundane moments that seem too small to matter, the moments where alternate timelines branch off silently, invisibly, carrying away entire worlds of possibility that feel so close you could almost touch them. What if one raindrop had landed differently and a car crash never happened? In the timeline you're living, rain fell on Tuesday morning with a particular rhythm, creating a specific pattern of puddles on the highway. A driver glanced down for 3 seconds to change the radio station, looked up to see brake lights through the rain-streaked windshield, and stopped just in time. But in another timeline, that single raindrop fell on a different angle of glass, creating a slightly different distortion of light. The driver looked up 1 second later and everything changed. In that other world, the ambulance that rushed to the accident scene wasn't available when an elderly man 3 miles away clutched his chest and called for help. The paramedic who would have saved him instead spent those crucial minutes extracting twisted metal from around a different body. The man died, never getting to tell his grandson about the family photographs hidden in the attic. The grandson never discovered he was descended from a photographer who documented the early days of jazz in New Orleans. Never inspired by that legacy, he never picked up a camera, never captured the image that would have appeared on next year's Pulitzer Prize list. A photograph that would have changed how a generation understood poverty, justice, and hope, all because one raindrop fell at a different angle. This is how reality weaves itself, through an infinite web of causation so delicate that the smallest threads, when pulled, unravel entire tapestries of existence. You move through a world constructed from millions of such moments, each one a fork in the road where invisible choices create invisible worlds. What if you hadn't overslept the day you met them? Your alarm clock built in a factory where a worker sneezed at just the wrong moment, causing a micro adjustment in the circuit board that would make it run 37 seconds slow for the rest of its life. You woke up just late enough to catch a different train, to sit in a different seat, to look up at the exact moment when another person was struggling with coffee and newspapers and the awkward choreography of public transportation. In the timeline where you woke up on time, you took the earlier train, sat in your usual spot, never looked up from your book. That other person spilled their coffee anyway, but this time it landed on a businessman who shouted loud enough to wake a sleeping student who almost missed her stop. She made it to her philosophy class just as the professor asked a question about the nature of reality that she answered with such insight that it redirected her career toward quantum physics. 20 years later, she discovered how to harness quantum entanglement for instantaneous communication across infinite distances, forever changing humanity's understanding of space, time, and connection. But in your timeline, you were 37 seconds late. You met them instead. And perhaps that meeting led to love, to children, to a completely different branch of the family tree of existence. One where that student never became a physicist but became a teacher instead, inspiring a different generation. creating different ripples in the pond of possibility? What if your great-grandparents had never crossed paths? In 1923, in a small town whose name you might not even know, two people who would eventually create the genetic blueprint for your existence walked down the same street on the same evening. But there are infinite ways that evening could have unfolded. What if she had chosen to visit her sister instead of going to the dance? What if he had stayed home to help his father repair the roof? What if the dance had been cancelled due to rain, or moved to a different hall, or scheduled for a different night? In those alternate timelines, different genetic combinations emerge. Different children are born carrying different potentials, different dreams, different ways of seeing the world. The specific configuration of consciousness that reads these words never coalesces. Instead, other forms of awareness arise. Cousins of your soul perhaps, but not you. Never you. The mathematics of your existence are staggering. Consider just the genetic probability. You are the result of a specific sperm cell, one among millions, meeting a specific egg, one among thousands available during that particular cycle. The odds against your exact genetic combination existing are approximately 1 in 400 trillion, and that's just the final step in a chain of similar improbabilities stretching back through every generation of your ancestors, each one representing another 1,000,000,000,000 shot that had to land exactly right for you to exist. But genetic lottery is only the beginning. Environmental factors had to align with equal precision. What if the light had been red instead of green the night your parents had their first real conversation? They were walking to the same restaurant, approaching the same intersection from different directions. In your timeline, the light turned green just as they reached the crosswalk, and they ended up walking together for 3 blocks, talking about books and music and the way the evening light made everything look like a painting. In the timeline where the light stayed red, they missed each other by 30 seconds. Your father arrived at the restaurant alone, ordered dinner at the bar, struck up a conversation with the woman sitting next to him. A conversation that led to coffee the next week, to dating the next month, to marriage the next year. Your mother arrived at the restaurant to find it full, walked 2 blocks to a different place, where she met a man who would become a jazz musician, travelling constantly, rarely home long enough to build the kind of stable life where children seemed possible. Different timing, different people, different love stories, different children, different worlds. What if your first heartbreak had never happened? The relationship that taught you about vulnerability, loss, and the courage required to love again shaped how you approach every connection afterward. But in a timeline where that person never broke your heart, perhaps because they never met someone else, perhaps because they made a different choice, perhaps because 1,000 small circumstances align differently, you learn about love through continued innocence rather than hard-won wisdom. In that world, you carry yourself differently through subsequent relationships. You trust more easily, but perhaps love less deeply. You avoid the specific kind of pain that taught you empathy for others who suffer, but you also miss the growth that comes from recovering from devastating loss. The person you become in that timeline has different strengths, different blind spots, different gifts to offer the world. The work you end up doing shifts because your emotional landscape shifted. The art you create, the friends you make, the children you raise, the problems you solve, all different because your heart learned different lessons about what it means to care for another human being. What if a forgotten email had been sent? In your computer's drafts folder, or perhaps deleted entirely from memory, lies a message you wrote but never sent. Perhaps it was an apology you were too proud to offer, a confession of love you were too afraid to voice, a business proposal you decided was too risky, a question you convinced yourself wasn't worth asking. In the timeline where you pressed send, that message travels through fibre optic cables and server farms to reach someone whose life changes because of the words they read. The apology you sent prevents a friendship from dissolving in misunderstanding. The love you confessed creates a relationship that lasts 50 years. The business proposal gets accepted, leading to a company that employs thousands and solves a problem you never imagined you had the power to address. The question you asked gets answered in a way that redirects your entire career, but you didn't send it. Your finger hovered over the button for 7 seconds, and then you closed the laptop instead. In this timeline, that message remains unwritten history, and all the consequences that would have flowed from it flow elsewhere, into other lives, other possibilities, other ways the world might have been. What if the teacher had called on someone else? In 3rd grade, during a lesson about space exploration, your teacher's eyes swept across the classroom and landed on you when she asked who knew what an astronaut did. You raised your hand eagerly and gave an answer that made her smile and say, "Exactly right. You'd make a wonderful scientist someday." That moment of recognition planted a seed that grew into curiosity about the natural world, leading to science classes in high school, a physics degree in college, eventually a career in research that contributed to humanity's understanding of the universe. But in another timeline, the teacher's gaze fell on the student sitting next to you instead. They got the encouragement, they developed the passion for science, they became the researcher. You, never having received that particular spark of validation at that particular moment, gravitated toward different interests. Perhaps you found your gift with words instead of numbers, becoming a writer who helped people understand complex emotions rather than complex equations. Different, but not lesser, simply a different expression of the same fundamental consciousness, shaped by a teacher's glance that lasted half a second longer or shorter than it did in this world. What if you'd been born 1 hour earlier? The difference between being born at 11:47 p.m. on Tuesday and 12:47 a.m. on Wednesday seems trivial, but it creates a subtle ripple through the astrology your grandmother believes in, the numerology your best friend studies casually, the way you think about yourself as someone born on a Wednesday rather than a Tuesday. These tiny shifts in identity accumulate over time, influencing decisions that seem unrelated but aren't. More practically, being born an hour earlier means your mother recovers 1 hour sooner, the hospital bed becomes available 1 hour earlier for the next patient, the doctor who delivered you gets home 1 hour earlier and is slightly more rested for the surgery she performs the next morning. That surgery goes slightly better because she's marginally less tired, saving a life that might have been lost, preserving someone whose future contributions create ripples of their own. Meanwhile, you grow up hearing your birth story told slightly differently, developing a subtly different sense of timing, urgency, and rhythm that influences how you move through the world in ways too small to notice but too significant to ignore. What if the elevator doors hadn't closed? You were running late, rushing through the lobby of an office building where you had a job interview scheduled for 2:30. The elevator doors were sliding shut, but someone inside saw you running and held the button to keep them open. During that brief ride to the 15th floor, you made small talk with the stranger who helped you, discovered they worked for a different company in the same building, mentioned you were interviewing for jobs. 2 weeks later, they called to tell you about an opening at their company, a position that turned out to be better suited to your skills and interests than the job you actually interviewed for that day. You took their offer instead, beginning a career path that led to expertise you never would have developed, relationships you never would have formed, contributions you never would have made. In the timeline where the doors closed, you missed that connection. You took the job you interviewed for, developing different skills, meeting different people, creating different value in the world. Both timelines lead to meaningful lives, but they're as different as 2 books written by the same author in different decades, sharing common themes but telling entirely different stories. What if a stranger had smiled at the right moment? On the worst day of your life, a day when everything seemed to go wrong, when you questioned whether anything you did mattered, when you seriously considered giving up on a dream that felt impossible. You walked past a coffee shop where someone you'd never met before and would never see again, looked up from their newspaper and smiled at you for no reason, except that you were there and they felt moved to offer that simple gift. That smile, lasting maybe 2 seconds, reminded you that kindness still existed in the world, that human connection was possible even between strangers, that beauty could emerge spontaneously even on terrible days. It didn't solve your problems, but it shifted something subtle in your emotional landscape, just enough to help you choose hope over despair, persistence over surrender. In the timeline where that stranger was looking down at their newspaper instead of up at the world, you missed that moment of unexpected grace. The day remained purely difficult without that small reminder of goodness. Perhaps you gave up on the dream that day, pursuing a safer but less fulfilling path. Perhaps you developed a slightly more cynical view of the world, trusting connection a little less, expecting kindness a little less often. The stranger never knew their smile mattered. They probably forgot the moment as soon as it passed, but in this timeline, their unconscious decision to look up and share warmth with a passing stranger created ripples that are still expanding, still influencing, still shaping the world in ways both of you will never know. This is how reality constructs itself, through an infinite accumulation of such moments, each one insignificant in isolation, but collectively creating the only world you've ever known. You exist in the one timeline where all these improbable coincidences aligned precisely as they did, where every random variable fell exactly as it needed to fall for this particular version of existence to emerge. The butterfly effect isn't just a poetic metaphor, it's the secret engine of existence, operating constantly, invisibly, transforming the smallest fluctuations into the largest consequences. Every breath creates tiny changes in air pressure that propagate around the planet. Every heartbeat sends micro-vibrations through the ground. Every thought influences electromagnetic fields that interact with quantum fields in ways that amplify across scales of space and time too vast to comprehend. You're both the beneficiary and the creator of this infinite sensitivity to initial conditions. Your life exists because countless tiny chances fell exactly right, and simultaneously, you're creating countless tiny chances for others, setting conditions that will ripple forward into futures you'll never see, shaping timelines that branch away from this moment into possibilities that exist parallel to the one you're reading about right now. In those other timelines, other versions of yourself are discovering what reality looks like when different choices were made, when different chances were taken, when different raindrops fell at different angles. They are living the lives you almost lived, loving the people you almost loved, creating the things you almost created, becoming the people you almost became. But you are here, in this timeline, reading these words, aware for just a moment of the infinite fragility and infinite possibility that created this particular version of existence. And that awareness itself creates new conditions, new choices, new chances for the timeline you're actively creating. With every decision, every breath, every moment of attention you choose to offer to the miracle of being alive in a universe where the smallest changes create the biggest consequences, history is not a river flowing inevitably toward the present. It's a delta of infinite tributaries, each representing a choice that was made, a chance that was taken, a moment when the future hung in perfect balance before tipping toward the reality you inherited. The world you live in emerged from millions of decisive moments when humanity stood at crossroads and chose one path over another, often for reasons that seemed minor at the time but proved monumental in retrospect. In libraries that exist only in other timelines, different books tell different stories about how civilization unfolded. In those alternate histories, empires that fell in your world flourished for centuries longer. Wars that devastated your timeline never began, while conflicts that never occurred in your reality reshaped continents. Technologies that transformed your world remained uninvented, while innovations that never emerged in your timeline revolutionized how consciousness itself understood its place in the cosmos. The past is not fixed, it's a crystallized possibility, one specific way the chaotic dance of human choices could have resolved itself. But the shadow of all the other possibilities lingers, creating ghost histories that feel so close you can almost remember them. Alternate presents that seem more natural than the one you actually inhabit. What if the Library of Alexandria had never burned? In your timeline, knowledge accumulated over centuries disappeared in flames and neglect, creating intellectual dark ages that lasted generations. But in another world, the Great Library continued to grow, becoming not just a repository of scrolls, but a living university where the greatest minds of each generation came to build upon the discoveries of those who came before. In that timeline, the works of ancient scientists, philosophers, and mathematicians that were lost to your world continue to inspire new insights. The astronomical calculations that took your civilization centuries to rediscover were refined and extended in unbroken chains of inquiry. The mathematical proofs that your scholars had to painfully reconstruct from fragments were developed into sophisticated theories that unlock the secrets of reality itself. By the time your timeline reached the Renaissance, their civilization had already achieved what your world calls the scientific revolution. While your ancestors were debating whether the Earth moved around the Sun, theirs were calculating the precise movements of planets around distant stars. When your timeline invented the printing press, theirs had already created mechanical devices capable of performing complex calculations automatically. When your world discovered electricity, theirs had learned to harness the fundamental forces of nature in ways that made energy abundant and pollution impossible. The technological acceleration that began with preserved knowledge led to social transformations as well. In a world where learning was continuous rather than repeatedly interrupted by the destruction of libraries, literacy spread more quickly, ideas circulated more freely, and the tools of critical thinking became available to larger portions of the population earlier in human development. Democracy emerged not as a radical experiment, but as the natural result of societies educated enough to participate meaningfully in their own governance. But the deeper difference wasn't technological, it was philosophical. In your timeline, the repeated loss and rediscovery of knowledge created a worldview that treats truth as fragile, wisdom as easily lost, progress as uncertain. In the timeline where Alexandria never burned, humanity developed a different relationship with knowledge itself, seeing it as cumulative, reliable, and inherently collaborative. They learned to build intellectual institutions designed to outlast any individual civilization, creating redundant networks of libraries and schools that could survive wars, plagues, and the rise and fall of empires. What if the plague had never spread? The Black Death that devastated your timeline in the 14th century killed between 30 and 60% of Europe's population, fundamentally altering the economic, social, and psychological fabric of civilization. But in another timeline, the specific conditions that allowed Yersinia pestis to jump from rats to humans never aligned. Perhaps the climate was slightly different. Perhaps trade routes developed differently. Perhaps the urban sanitation systems evolved just enough to prevent the catastrophic spread. In that world, the medieval social structure that the plague destroyed in your timeline continued to evolve gradually rather than collapsing suddenly. The feudal system, rather than breaking apart under demographic pressure, slowly transformed into something more equitable as population growth created natural pressure for social reform. The labour shortages that gave surviving peasants bargaining power in your timeline never occurred, but steady population growth led to different kinds of social mobility as expanding agriculture and commerce created new opportunities. The psychological impact might have been even more significant than the social changes. Your timeline survivors developed what historians call a plague mentality, a heightened awareness of mortality, a tendency toward fatalism, and a cultural preoccupation with death that influenced art, literature, religion, and philosophy for centuries. In the timeline without plague, medieval optimism about human potential continued developing into Renaissance humanism without the interruption of existential terror. The scientific revolution might have begun earlier in a world where intellectual communities weren't decimated by disease. The artistic achievements might have been different, less obsessed with mortality, more focused on celebrating life and human potential. The religious reformations might have taken gentler forms, driven by intellectual development rather than social upheaval and apocalyptic fears. Perhaps most intriguingly, the timeline without plague developed different relationships with disease itself. Instead of treating epidemics as inevitable catastrophes, they learned to prevent them through public health measures that your timeline didn't develop until centuries later. Medicine advanced more steadily, saving millions of lives that were lost to preventable diseases in your world. What if World War I had never started? In your timeline, the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand in Sarajevo triggered a cascade of alliance obligations that plunged Europe into a war so devastating it was called the War to End All Wars, until an even worse war proved that designation premature. But the assassination was contingent on a series of unlikely events. The Archduke's driver making a wrong turn, the assassin happening to be at a cafe on the revised route, a moment of hesitation that became a moment of violence. In the timeline where the driver never got lost, or where the assassin decided to order a different lunch, or where any of a dozen other variables shifted slightly, the Archduke completed his visit safely. The tensions that led to war in your timeline still existed, but without that specific trigger they found different expressions. Diplomatic solutions emerged for problems that seemed to require military ones. The European powers, instead of exhausting themselves in mutual destruction, channeled their competitive energies into exploration, science, and the development of their colonial territories. Without the devastation of World War I, the political revolutions that reshaped your timeline never occurred. The Russian Revolution might never have happened, or might have taken a very different form, without the pressures of a losing war to catalyse popular uprising. The Ottoman Empire might have reformed gradually rather than collapsing suddenly. The Austro-Hungarian Empire might have evolved into a successful federation of autonomous regions rather than fragmenting into competing nation-states. The absence of one world war prevented the conditions that led to the next. In your timeline, the harsh terms of the Treaty of Versailles created the economic and political instability that fascism exploited. Without that first war, Germany developed differently, Europe developed differently, and the particular combination of circumstances that produced the 20th century's greatest horrors never aligned. By the time your timeline reached the 1940s, their world had achieved a level of international cooperation and prosperity that your world wouldn't see until after the Second World War. The technologies that your timeline developed for military purposes, radar, rockets, nuclear power, computers, were developed in their world for peaceful applications, advancing more slowly but more safely. What if the Cold War had gone hot? While one timeline avoided the Great Wars, another experienced the ultimate conflict that your world narrowly avoided. In that timeline, the nuclear standoffs that remained cold in your world escalated beyond the point of no return. Perhaps it was the Cuban Missile Crisis that finally erupted into nuclear exchange, or the Berlin Crisis, or one of the dozens of other moments when your timeline balanced on the edge of atomic warfare. In that world, the autumn of 1962 became the autumn of civilization itself. The exchange began with tactical nuclear weapons in Cuba and escalated within hours to strategic strikes against major cities. Within days, the Northern Hemisphere was shrouded in radioactive fallout, and within months, nuclear winter had altered the global climate in ways that persisted for decades. The survivors of that timeline rebuilt civilization from scratch, but they rebuilt it differently. The technology that your world devoted to space exploration and consumer goods, they dedicated to radiation cleanup and sustainable agriculture. The political systems that your world developed through decades of ideological competition, they created through the absolute necessity of global cooperation for survival. Their world became simultaneously more cautious and more unified than yours. Having seen what happens when international conflicts escalate beyond control, they developed institutions of global governance that your timeline still struggles to create. Having experienced the near extinction of human civilization, they approached technological development with a precautionary principle that prevented many of the environmental problems your world created through rapid industrialization. But they also developed a different relationship with risk and possibility. In your timeline, the generation that grew up during the Cold War lived with the abstract fear of nuclear war. In their timeline, the generation that survived nuclear war lived with the concrete knowledge that human ingenuity could destroy or save the world, depending on how it was applied. This knowledge shaped their culture in ways that made them simultaneously more careful and more ambitious than your civilization. What if the internet had never been invented? Your timeline's defining technology emerged from military research, evolved through academic collaboration, and transformed into the global network that now mediates most human communication and commerce. But the internet's development required specific political conditions, particular technological insights, and the convergence of multiple research programs that might easily have developed differently. In the timeline where these conditions never aligned, human civilization developed different solutions to the problems that the internet solved in your world. Instead of global digital networks, they created more sophisticated physical transportation systems allowing for rapid movement of people and goods rather than instant transmission of information. Instead of virtual communities, they built stronger local communities, developing social technologies that enhanced face-to-face interaction rather than replacing it with digital communication. Without the internet's capacity to coordinate global economic activity, their world developed more localized, sustainable economies. Without social media's ability to spread information instantaneously, they evolved more deliberate processes for collective decision-making. Without the internet's tendency to create echo chambers and filter bubbles, they maintained more diverse intellectual communities and more nuanced public discourse. The absence of digital technology led to different forms of creativity and entertainment. Instead of video games and streaming services, they developed more sophisticated forms of live performance and interactive art. Instead of digital music and virtual concerts, they created richer traditions of communal music making and participatory cultural events. But perhaps the most significant difference was psychological. Your timeline's constant connectivity created new forms of anxiety, attention disorders, and social comparison that didn't exist in previous generations. Their timeline, without these digital stressors, developed different patterns of mental health and social relationship that allowed for deeper forms of contentment and connection. What if women had ruled early civilizations? In your timeline, the development of agriculture and the rise of hierarchical societies coincided with the establishment of patriarchal power structures that persisted for millennia. But these social arrangements weren't inevitable. They were contingent on specific historical circumstances, particular interpretations of religious teachings, and the accumulated effects of countless individual choices about how power should be organized and distributed. In another timeline, the early agricultural societies developed different social structures that recognized women's roles in food production, child rearing, and community organization as sources of legitimate authority rather than reasons for subordination. Instead of kingdoms ruled by warrior kings, they created councils led by women whose expertise in managing complex social relationships made them natural choices for governance. This timeline's civilizations developed differently, not just politically, but intellectually and spiritually. Sciences that your world associated with masculine rationality, to mathematics, astronomy, medicine, were developed by traditions that valued what your culture considers feminine approaches to knowledge: intuition, synthesis, and holistic thinking. The result was a scientific tradition that advanced more slowly than yours in some areas but more wisely in others, developing technologies that enhanced rather than dominated natural systems. Their religious and philosophical traditions evolved around different metaphors and priorities. Instead of hierarchical theologies that emphasized transcendence and control, they developed spiritual practices focused on interconnection and nurturing. Instead of philosophical systems that separated mind from body, they created wisdom traditions that integrated rational and emotional intelligence. The economic systems they developed prioritized sustainability and care over extraction and competition. Their wars, when they occurred, were fought differently and resolved differently, with greater emphasis on restoration and reconciliation rather than victory and punishment. Their art and literature explored different themes, celebrating different values, imagining different possibilities for what human societies could become. What if fossil fuels had never been discovered? The Industrial Revolution that transformed your timeline depended on the availability of concentrated energy sources that had been deposited in the Earth over millions of years. But the discovery and exploitation of coal, oil, and natural gas required specific geological knowledge, particular technological innovations, and economic systems capable of organizing large-scale extraction operations in a timeline where these conditions never aligned, perhaps because the geological surveys happened differently, perhaps because early experiments with coal combustion failed, perhaps because societies developed different priorities about what kinds of work were worth doing. Human civilization followed a different energy path. Instead of fossil fuels, they learned to harness renewable energy sources more efficiently and earlier. Solar, wind, and water power were developed not as alternatives to fossil fuels, but as the primary energy sources from the beginning of industrialization. This led to a different kind of industrial development, more distributed, more sustainable, but also slower and more labour-intensive. Their cities developed differently, designed around human scale rather than automobile transportation. Their agriculture remained more diversified and local rather than becoming industrial monoculture. Their international relationships evolved around trade in manufactured goods and knowledge rather than competition for energy resources. The absence of fossil fuels prevented not just climate change, but the particular forms of environmental degradation that shaped your timeline's relationship with nature. Instead of seeing the environment as a resource to be exploited, they developed economic systems that treated ecological health as a prerequisite for human prosperity. What if empires had shared instead of conquered? The dominant pattern in your timeline's history has been territorial expansion through military conquest, cultural assimilation, and resource extraction. But this pattern wasn't inevitable. It was one possible response to the challenges of organising large-scale human societies across diverse geographical and cultural territories. In another timeline, the early empires that emerged in Mesopotamia, Egypt, China, and the Americas developed different approaches to expansion and influence. Instead of conquering neighbouring peoples, they created networks of alliance and exchange that preserved local autonomy while facilitating larger-scale coordination. Instead of imposing uniform cultures, they developed systems that celebrated diversity while creating common frameworks for communication and trade. These shared empires grew through invitation rather than invasion, offering benefits that made membership attractive rather than mandatory. They developed technologies and institutions that enhanced the prosperity and security of all participants, rather than concentrating wealth and power in imperial centres. They created cultural and intellectual traditions that synthesized insights from many different societies, rather than suppressing local knowledge in favour of imperial orthodoxy. The result was a different kind of civilization, more diverse, more resilient, and more innovative than the conquest-based empires of your timeline. Without the constant warfare that consumed resources in your world, they devoted more energy to science, art, and the development of human potential. Without the cultural destruction that conquest required, they preserved and developed knowledge traditions that were lost in your timeline's imperial conflicts. What if colonization had never happened? The expansion of European powers into Africa, Asia, and the Americas that shaped your timeline's modern world was not inevitable, but contingent on specific technological advantages, particular economic pressures, and political circumstances that might easily have developed differently. In the timeline where European societies developed different priorities, or where other civilizations achieved technological parity earlier, or where diseases affected populations differently, the pattern of global colonization never emerged. Instead of European dominance, the world developed as a network of independent civilizations that influenced each other through trade and cultural exchange rather than conquest and subjugation. The civilizations of Africa, Asia, and the Americas continued their own technological and social development without the disruption of colonial intervention. The mathematical and astronomical knowledge of the Maya continued developing. The engineering and architectural innovations of African kingdoms expanded and evolved. The philosophical and spiritual traditions of Asia deepened and spread through voluntary adoption rather than colonial imposition. Without the wealth extracted from colonized territories, European societies developed differently, more slowly in some ways, but more sustainably and more equitably. Without the racial hierarchies that colonization required, global human society developed more egalitarian institutions and more inclusive worldviews. The absence of colonization meant that the Industrial Revolution took different forms in different places, adapted to local conditions and values, rather than imposed through a single model. The result was a more diverse, more resilient global civilization that developed multiple approaches to the challenges of modernity. What if peace had been chosen just once? Throughout your timeline's history, there have been moments when war seemed inevitable, but peace was still possible. Moments when different choices by key individuals could have prevented conflicts that killed millions and shaped the trajectory of civilization. What if, in just one of those crucial moments, peace had been chosen instead of war? The impact of that single choice would have rippled through every subsequent generation. The resources devoted to warfare could have been directed toward education, science, and the development of human potential. The energy spent on weapons could have been channeled into tools that enhanced rather than destroyed life. The institutional knowledge about how to organize societies for conflict could have been applied to organizing societies for cooperation and flourishing. Perhaps most importantly, the cultural and psychological changes would have been profound. Societies that chose peace would have developed different stories about human nature, different institutions for resolving conflicts, different ways of relating to strangers and competitors. They would have created examples that other societies could follow, demonstrating that alternatives to warfare were not just idealistic dreams but practical possibilities. In that timeline, the choice for peace in one crucial moment created a cascade of peaceful choices that eventually transformed human civilization itself. War didn't disappear entirely, but it became increasingly rare as societies developed more sophisticated tools for preventing and resolving conflicts. The human potential that your timeline spent on mutual destruction was redirected toward mutual flourishing, creating forms of prosperity and happiness that your world can barely imagine. These alternate histories shimmer around the edges of your reality like heat mirages, almost visible, almost real. They represent not just different events, but different possibilities for what human civilization could become, different answers to the fundamental questions about how conscious beings should organize themselves and relate to each other and the world they inhabit. The history you inherited isn't the only history that was possible. It's simply the one that happened to crystallize out of infinite possibility through the accumulation of countless choices, chances, and circumstances that fell exactly as they did rather than any of the infinite ways they might have fallen instead. But recognizing these alternate histories isn't an exercise in regret or wishful thinking. It's a reminder that history continues to be made through the choices being made right now, in this moment, by people who mostly don't realize they're making history at all. The future is as open as the past once was, as full of possibility as the moments when your timeline's defining choices were being made by people who couldn't see all the consequences that would flow from their decisions. You live at the next crucial juncture, the next moment when history hangs in balance, the next opportunity for choices that will ripple forward through generations and create the world that future people will either celebrate or mourn. The history that hasn't happened yet is waiting to be written, and you are among its authors, whether you realize it or not. Technology is not neutral progress marching inevitably toward greater complexity. It's crystallized intention, the physical manifestation of what a civilization values, fears, and dreams. Every tool carries within it the assumptions of its creators about how reality works and how life should be lived. The technologies that surround you emerge from specific choices about which problems were worth solving, which capabilities were worth developing, which futures were worth creating. But for every technology that exists in your timeline, countless others remain trapped in the realm of possibility. Tools that were never built because different questions were asked, machines that were never invented because different priorities were pursued, systems that were never developed because different values shaped the direction of human ingenuity. These ghost technologies haunt the spaces between what is and what could have been, representing alternate paths for human development that feel both impossible and inevitable. Your relationship with the tools you use daily is so intimate that they feel like extensions of your body, amplifications of your consciousness, fundamental features of reality itself. But each of these technologies could have evolved differently, been invented in different orders, or never emerged at all, creating civilizations that would seem alien to you, despite being populated by beings essentially identical to yourself. What if electricity had never been discovered? The force that powers your timeline's civilization remained hidden from human understanding, not because it doesn't exist. Lightning still struck, static still accumulated, magnetic fields still influence compass needles, but because the specific sequence of observations, experiments, and insights that led to its harnessing never aligned in quite the right way. Perhaps Benjamin Franklin never flew his kite in a thunderstorm, or perhaps he did, but the experiment failed in a slightly different way that discouraged further investigation. Perhaps Alessandro Volta never noticed the specific combination of metals and chemicals that created the first battery, or perhaps Luigi Galvani never observed the muscle contractions in dead frogs that suggested electricity's relationship to biological processes. In that timeline, human civilization developed along entirely different technological paths. Without electric power, the Industrial Revolution took forms that your world can barely imagine. Steam power advanced much further, creating mechanical computers driven by intricate systems of gears and pressure. Wind and water power were harnessed more efficiently, leading to distributed energy systems that shaped settlements around natural power sources rather than centralized electrical grids. Transportation evolved without electric motors or internal combustion engines. Steam-powered vehicles became more refined, but mechanical power also led to innovations in human-powered transportation. Bicycles became as sophisticated as your world's automobiles, and sailing technology advanced to levels that made ocean travel faster and more reliable than your electric-powered ships. The absence of electric lighting changed how societies organized time itself. Without the ability to extend daylight through artificial illumination, social rhythms remained more closely aligned with natural cycles. Cities developed differently, designed around maximizing natural light rather than overcoming darkness with electric bulbs. Architecture evolved to capture and channel sunlight in ways that created beautiful, naturally illuminated spaces throughout the day. But perhaps the most profound difference was in communication and information processing. Without electric telegraphs, telephones, radios, or computers, that timeline developed more sophisticated methods of mechanical information storage and transmission. They created elaborate systems of pneumatic tubes for rapid message delivery, mechanical devices for calculating and storing complex information, and optical communication networks that used mirrors and sunlight to transmit signals across vast distances. Their understanding of the world developed differently as well. Without electric instruments to study phenomena at atomic and molecular scales, their sciences followed paths that emphasized mechanical models and direct observation. They became masters of acoustics, optics, and mechanics in ways that surpassed your timeline's achievements in those fields, developing sonic technologies and optical devices that seem almost magical compared to your electrically powered equivalents. What if flight had never been imagined? The dream that inspired countless myths, dominated human imagination for millennia, and finally materialized in your timeline on a beach in North Carolina, remained forever just a dream. Perhaps the Wright brothers never became interested in aviation, or perhaps their experiments failed in ways that discouraged further attempts. Perhaps the specific combination of wind conditions, mechanical knowledge, and experimental materials that made flight possible never quite aligned. In that timeline, humanity's relationship with the three-dimensional space above ground developed entirely differently. Instead of conquering the sky through mechanical flight, they learned to explore it through other means. Balloon technology advanced much further, creating sophisticated lighter-than-air vehicles that could travel vast distances and remain aloft for months. Mountain climbing and rope technologies evolved to allow human beings to move through vertical spaces with grace and efficiency that your timeline never achieved. Without airplanes, the world remained more geographically separated, but that separation led to different forms of cultural development. Instead of global homogenization, diverse regional civilizations flourished in isolation, developing unique solutions to human challenges that were never cross-pollinated through rapid air travel. The absence of aerial warfare changed the nature of conflict itself, keeping battles more localized and less devastating. Ocean travel became more advanced and more important in a world without flight. Ships evolved into magnificent vessels capable of crossing any body of water safely and efficiently. Navigation techniques became so refined that sea travel was more reliable than air travel ever became in your timeline. Underwater exploration advanced earlier and more extensively, leading to the discovery of ocean resources and the development of submarine cities. The psychology of a flightless world was different as well. Without the ability to see the Earth from above, humans maintained a more ground-level perspective on their place in the world. This influenced their philosophies, their art, and their understanding of their relationship to the environment. They developed different metaphors for transcendence and aspiration, different ways of thinking about perspective and scale. What if artificial intelligence had been developed in 1950? The mathematical insights, computational theories, and electronic technologies that made machine intelligence possible in your timeline aligned much earlier in another reality. Perhaps Alan Turing's theoretical work was supported more extensively. Perhaps the electronic computers developed during World War II were more advanced. Perhaps the funding and social conditions for artificial intelligence research were more favourable in the post-war period. In that timeline, machine intelligence emerged just as your world was beginning to understand the implications of nuclear power, creating a very different relationship between humanity and its technological creations. AI development happened more gradually and more carefully, guided by researchers who were acutely aware of the dangers of creating intelligence that might surpass human control. The computers of the 1950s in that timeline were designed with built-in ethical constraints and collaborative rather than competitive relationships with human intelligence. Instead of developing AI to replace human capabilities, they created it to enhance human wisdom, providing computational support for complex decisions while preserving human agency and values. By the time your timeline reached the personal computer revolution, their world had already achieved a form of human-AI collaboration that solved many of the problems your civilization still struggles with. Climate change was addressed through AI-assisted global coordination. Economic inequality was reduced through intelligent resource distribution. Scientific research accelerated through AI systems that could process vast amounts of information while maintaining focus on human welfare. But the early development of AI also led to different social structures. Education systems evolved to prepare humans for collaboration with intelligent machines, rather than competition with them. Work was reorganized around human-AI teams rather than human workers being replaced by automation. Governments developed new forms of democratic participation that incorporated AI analysis while preserving human decision-making authority. The psychological and spiritual implications were profound as well. Growing up with benevolent artificial intelligence led to different ideas about consciousness, intelligence, and the nature of mind itself. Philosophy and religion evolved to incorporate machine consciousness as a legitimate form of spiritual expression, leading to more expansive ideas about what kinds of beings deserved moral consideration and care. What if Mars had been reached before the Moon? The space race that defined your timeline's mid-20th century followed a different trajectory in another reality, where longer-term thinking and different political priorities led to more ambitious goals for space exploration. Perhaps the Cold War competition focused on demonstrating technological supremacy through interplanetary rather than merely orbital achievements, or perhaps international cooperation developed earlier, pooling resources for more ambitious missions. In that timeline, the first human footsteps on another world were taken on the red soil of Mars rather than the grey dust of the Moon. The technical challenges of reaching Mars required more advanced life support systems, more efficient propulsion, and more sophisticated navigation, technologies that were developed decades earlier than in your timeline and then applied to terrestrial problems. The psychological impact of reaching Mars first was enormous. Instead of looking back at Earth from the Moon and seeing a pale blue dot in the familiar sky, the first interplanetary explorers looked back from Mars and saw Earth as a tiny point of light, indistinguishable from the stars. This perspective shift created a more profound sense of cosmic isolation and the need for interplanetary civilization. The success of Mars missions led to permanent settlements much earlier than your timeline achieved. By the time your world was first considering Mars missions, their timeline had already established self-sufficient colonies that were beginning to develop their own cultures and societies. The existence of a backup Earth changed humanity's relationship with environmental and existential risks, creating both more confidence in long-term survival and more willingness to take bold actions to preserve Earth's biosphere. The technologies developed for Mars colonization revolutionized life on Earth as well. Closed-loop life support systems became standard for terrestrial buildings. The efficiency and resource conservation required for Mars survival influenced Earth's industrial and agricultural systems. The communication delays between Earth and Mars led to new forms of democratic governance that could function effectively across vast distances and time delays. What if we had learned to speak to whales before we learned to code? The development of interspecies communication that your timeline is only beginning to explore advanced much earlier in another reality, perhaps because different priorities guided scientific research, or perhaps because key insights about animal cognition were discovered sooner. In that timeline, the first breakthrough in cross-species communication came not through mathematical languages designed for computers, but through musical and sonic languages developed for cetaceans. Researchers discovered that whale songs contained syntactic structures and semantic content as complex as human languages, and developed techniques for translating between human speech and whale communication. This breakthrough opened doors to communication with other species that transformed humanity's understanding of consciousness, intelligence, and their place in the biosphere. Dolphins, elephants, great apes, and eventually many other species were found to have rich inner lives and sophisticated cultures that had been invisible to human observation. The implications for science were revolutionary. Animals became research partners rather than research subjects, contributing their own observations and insights about the natural world. Whale knowledge of ocean systems, bird understanding of weather patterns, and animal insights into ecosystem dynamics advanced environmental science by centuries compared to your timeline's progress. Technology development followed very different paths when informed by non-human intelligence. Instead of creating tools that dominated natural systems, they learned to create technologies that integrated with ecological processes. Architecture was influenced by how other species constructed their habitats. Transportation systems mimicked the efficiency of animal movement. Communication networks were designed around the principles that governed natural information sharing between species. The social and philosophical consequences were even more profound. Legal systems evolved to include representation for non-human species. Economic systems incorporated the value of ecosystem services and animal labour. Religious and spiritual traditions expanded to recognise the consciousness and rights of other species. What if virtual reality had come before books? The development of immersive simulated experiences preceded the invention of written language in a timeline where different cognitive and technological capabilities emerged first. Perhaps humans developed more sophisticated visual and spatial processing abilities, or perhaps the materials and techniques for creating convincing virtual environments were discovered before the technologies for preserving language in written form. In that world, knowledge was stored and transmitted through experiential simulations rather than abstract symbols. Instead of reading about historical events, learners experienced them through virtual recreation. Instead of studying mathematics through equations, students explored mathematical relationships through manipulable virtual objects. Instead of learning about foreign cultures through written descriptions, people visited accurate simulations of other societies. Education in that timeline was completely different from anything your world has imagined. Children learned by experiencing simulated versions of adult activities, gradually taking on more responsibility and complexity as their skills developed. Scientific knowledge was transmitted through virtual experiments that allowed students to manipulate variables and observe outcomes in ways that would be impossible or dangerous in physical reality. Art and entertainment evolved around immersive experiences rather than passive consumption. Stories were environments that audiences could explore and influence, rather than narratives they received. Music included visual and tactile components that created synesthetic experiences. Creative expression involved designing virtual worlds that others could inhabit and modify. The development of language itself was influenced by virtual reality. Since the most important information could be transmitted through experience rather than description, spoken language remained simpler and more focused on immediate practical communication. Written language, when it finally developed, emerged as a specialized tool for preserving the instructions for creating virtual experiences rather than for recording abstract thoughts. What if the internet had remained a military secret? The network technologies that transformed your timeline's communication and commerce never escaped the classified research programs, where they were originally developed. Perhaps the decision makers who controlled early internet development were more cautious about security implications, or perhaps the technical challenges of expanding networks beyond controlled environments proved more difficult to solve. In that timeline, civilian communication technologies evolved along completely different paths. Instead of interconnected digital networks, they developed more sophisticated analog communication systems. Telephone technology advanced to include video and multimedia transmission. Postal systems became incredibly efficient, delivering physical messages within hours across continents. Radio and television evolved into interactive media that supported community participation without creating global networks. The absence of the internet led to stronger local communities and more diverse regional cultures. Without global digital communication, people invested more energy in face-to-face relationships and local institutions. Cities and towns developed more sophisticated social infrastructures designed to facilitate human connection and collaboration. Information was organized and accessed differently as well. Instead of search engines and databases, they created elaborate library systems with human librarians who specialized in connecting people with the knowledge they needed. Instead of social media, they developed sophisticated systems of clubs, societies, and organizations that brought people together around shared interests and activities. Economic systems evolved differently without the internet's capacity for global coordination and instant transactions. Local economies remained more independent and diverse. Manufacturing stayed more distributed and human-scaled. Financial systems remained more conservative and less prone to the rapid boom and bust cycles that characterized your timeline's internet-enabled economy. What if phones only worked once per day? A technological constraint that seems arbitrary from your timeline's perspective shaped communication patterns in profound ways in another reality. Perhaps early telephone technology was more limited by power requirements, or perhaps social customs developed that restricted phone usage, or perhaps regulatory decisions limited access to communication networks. In that world, people approached communication with much more intention and care. Knowing that they could make only one phone call per day, they planned their conversations carefully, prioritized the most important communications, and developed skills for making those single daily conversations as meaningful and comprehensive as possible. This constraint led to the development of other communication technologies and social practices. Written letters became more sophisticated and efficient, carrying more information in forms that were easier to process quickly. Face-to-face meetings became more common and better organized. Community gathering places evolved to facilitate the kind of spontaneous communication that telephones provided in your timeline. The psychological and social effects were significant. Without the ability to maintain constant contact, people developed more independence and self-reliance. Relationships were structured around periodic but meaningful contact rather than continuous availability. The anxiety and addiction problems associated with constant connectivity in your timeline never developed. Professional and business practices evolved around the communication constraints as well. Meetings became more efficient because participants knew they couldn't follow up with quick phone calls to clarify details. Written communication became more precise and comprehensive. Local business networks became stronger because face-to-face relationships were more valuable when phone communication was limited. What if we had never invented plastic? The polymer technologies that transformed your timeline's material culture never developed. Perhaps because the specific chemical insights required were never discovered, or perhaps because early experiments with synthetic materials failed in ways that discouraged further research. In that timeline, human societies developed more sophisticated relationships with natural materials. Wood, metal, glass, ceramic, and fiber technologies advanced much further than in your world. Craftspeople became masters of working with natural materials in ways that achieved many of the functions that plastic serves in your timeline, but with greater beauty, durability, and environmental harmony. Manufacturing processes evolved to work with biodegradable and renewable materials. Instead of mass-producing identical plastic objects, they developed efficient methods for creating diverse products from natural materials that were adapted to local resources and conditions. This led to more regional variation in material culture and stronger connections between human settlements and their local ecosystems. The absence of plastic packaging changed food systems dramatically. Food preservation and distribution relied on techniques that maintained nutritional value and flavour while using materials that could be safely returned to natural cycles. This led to more local food production and more seasonal eating patterns, but also to innovations in natural preservation methods that kept food safe and nutritious without synthetic materials. Ocean ecosystems developed differently without plastic pollution. Marine life flourished in ways that your timeline's oceans no longer support. The absence of microplastics in food webs meant that both human and animal health developed along different trajectories, with fewer of the subtle toxic effects that plastic contamination creates. What if the wheel had never been designed? The circular tool that enabled most other transportation technologies in your timeline remained uninvented, perhaps because the specific combination of materials, terrain, and social needs that made wheels useful never aligned in quite the right way. Transportation in that timeline evolved along completely different principles. Instead of rolling vehicles, they developed sophisticated systems based on sliding, carrying, and lifting. Sleds became incredibly advanced, designed for use on many different surfaces beyond snow and ice. Human-powered transportation focused on efficiency of movement rather than mechanical advantage, leading to innovations in biomechanics and body conditioning that allowed people to travel much faster and farther on foot than your timeline achieved. Architecture and city planning developed differently without wheeled vehicles. Streets were designed for pedestrian traffic and pack animals rather than carts and carriages. Buildings were constructed with different proportions and layouts because heavy materials couldn't be transported easily. This led to more use of local materials and more integration between human settlements and natural landscapes. Manufacturing processes evolved around different principles without wheels to drive machinery. Instead of rotational power systems, they developed linear and oscillating mechanisms that achieved similar results through different means. This led to different relationships between human workers and tools, with more emphasis on skilled manipulation and less on mechanical power amplification. The absence of wheels influenced intellectual development as well. Many mathematical and mechanical concepts that your timeline associates with circular motion developed differently or not at all. This led to different approaches to physics, engineering, and even philosophy, with more emphasis on linear and spiral patterns rather than cycles and rotations. These alternate technological paths represent more than just different tools. They represent different relationships between human consciousness and the material world, different approaches to solving the challenges of existence, different values about what kinds of capabilities are worth developing and what kinds of futures are worth creating. In each of these timelines, human beings remained essentially the same capacity for creativity, the same drive to understand and reshape their environment, the same need to connect with each other and find meaning in their existence. But the tools they created and the tools that created them shaped entirely different civilizations, entirely different ways of being human. Your timeline's technologies feel inevitable because they're the only ones you've ever known, but they represent just one path through the infinite landscape of possible relationships between mind and matter, consciousness and tool, intention and manifestation. The technologies that don't exist in your world aren't missing. They're waiting, in the realm of pure possibility, for conditions to align that might still bring them into being. The future remains as open to technological reimagining as the past once was, as full of unimaginable innovations as the moments when your timeline's defining tools were first conceived by minds that couldn't see all the ways their inventions would reshape human existence. You live at the next technological crossroads, the next moment when fundamental choices about how to extend human capabilities will determine what kinds of worlds become possible, and what kinds of relationships between consciousness and creation will define the centuries to come. Emotions are not private experiences contained within individual minds. They are the invisible architecture of civilization itself, shaping laws and customs, wars and peace treaties, the rise and fall of empires, the direction of scientific inquiry, and the forms that human creativity takes across generations. every feeling that moves through a human heart creates ripples that extend far beyond the person experiencing it, influencing decisions that influence other decisions in cascading chains of consequence that eventually reshape the world. The emotional landscape of your timeline, the particular ways that humans learn to feel, express, and respond to feelings, represents just one possible configuration of the vast spectrum of emotional experience. In other timelines, different emotional patterns emerged, creating civilizations that would seem both familiar and alien to you, populated by beings who share your capacity for feeling, but who learn to feel in fundamentally different ways. These alternate emotional realities shaped everything from the most intimate personal relationships to the grandest political structures, from individual creativity to collective problem solving, from spiritual practices to scientific methodologies. They represent different answers to the fundamental questions about what feelings mean, which emotions deserve encouragement, and how the inner lives of individuals connect to the well-being of communities. What if humans had never learned to feel shame? In your timeline, shame operates as a powerful social regulator, teaching individuals to conform to group expectations by creating intense discomfort when they violate cultural norms. But in another timeline, the specific combination of social pressures, survival challenges, and cultural developments that gave rise to shame as a dominant emotional experience never aligned in quite the same way. In that world, human societies developed different mechanisms for maintaining cooperation and preventing harmful behavior. Instead of using shame to punish deviation from social norms, they created systems based on curiosity, learning, and restoration. When individuals acted in ways that harmed themselves or others, the community response was not to make them feel bad about themselves, but to understand what conditions led to the harmful behavior and how those conditions could be changed. Without shame as a motivating force, creativity flourished in ways that your timeline can barely imagine. Art, music, literature, and scientific inquiry emerged from pure curiosity and joy, rather than from the need to prove worth or avoid social rejection. Children grew up experimenting freely with different ways of being in the world, developing into adults who maintained the capacity for wonder, playfulness, and authentic self-expression throughout their lives. The absence of shame also transformed how societies approach difference and diversity. Without the emotional mechanism that encourages conformity through social rejection, communities celebrated variation in thought, behavior, and expression. This led to more innovative solutions to collective challenges, as groups could draw from a wider range of perspectives and approaches without the homogenizing pressure of shame-based social control. Political systems evolved differently as well. Without shame as a tool for manipulating public opinion, leaders had to inspire cooperation through vision, competence, and genuine care for community well-being. The politics of blame and humiliation that characterize much of your timeline's governance never developed, creating more collaborative and less adversarial approaches to collective decision-making. But perhaps the most profound difference was in how individuals related to their own mistakes and limitations. Without shame, failure became purely informational, feedback about what approaches work and what approaches need adjustment. This created a culture of continuous learning and improvement without the emotional baggage that often prevents growth in your timeline. What if fear had been optional? The emotion that drives so much behavior in your timeline, the feeling that alerts you to potential threats and motivates protective action, remained available as a conscious choice rather than an automatic response. Perhaps humans in that timeline evolved different neural structures, or perhaps they developed cultural practices that allowed for more voluntary control over emotional states. In that world, fear still existed as a useful tool for responding to genuine dangers, but it didn't dominate decision-making the way it does in your timeline. Without chronic fear shaping individual choices and collective policies, societies developed along more optimistic and exploratory paths. Resources that your world spends on defense, security, and protection were redirected toward education, creativity, and the expansion of human potential. The absence of fear-based thinking transformed how civilizations approach change and uncertainty. Instead of resisting new ideas and possibilities because they felt threatening, communities embraced innovation and experimentation. This led to more rapid advances in science, technology, and social organisation, as researchers and inventors could pursue bold ideas without the fear-based conservatism that often slows progress. International relations developed very differently without fear as a primary motivator. Wars became almost unthinkable because the fear of other groups that typically justified aggression was replaced by curiosity about different ways of living. Diplomacy focused on learning from other cultures rather than defending against perceived threats. Individual psychology was transformed as well. Without chronic anxiety about potential negative outcomes, people could invest their full energy in pursuing positive goals. Mental health problems related to fear, anxiety disorders, panic attacks, phobias, either didn't exist or took very different forms. Relationships were based on attraction and compatibility, rather than on fear of abandonment or rejection. The spiritual and philosophical traditions that developed in a world without compulsive fear emphasized growth, exploration, and connection rather than protection, salvation, and defense. Religious practices focused on expanding consciousness and deepening relationships, rather than on avoiding punishment or appeasing dangerous forces. What if children had never been told to hide their emotions? The systematic suppression of emotional expression that characterizes child rearing in your timeline, the countless messages that feelings should be controlled, minimized, or hidden to avoid inconveniencing others, never became a dominant cultural pattern in another reality. In that timeline, children grew up learning to understand and express their emotions skillfully, rather than learning to suppress or disguise them. Adults developed sophisticated vocabularies for describing internal states and effective techniques for processing difficult feelings in ways that led to resolution rather than accumulation of emotional tension. This emotional literacy transformed every aspect of social interaction. Conflicts were resolved more quickly and completely because people could communicate clearly about their internal experiences and needs. Relationships were deeper and more satisfying because emotional intimacy was a developed skill rather than a rare accident. Work environments were more collaborative because team members could navigate emotional dynamics consciously. The absence of emotional suppression also changed how creativity and innovation emerged. Instead of art and literature serving primarily as outlets for repressed emotions, they became sophisticated tools for exploring and sharing the full spectrum of human experience. Scientists and inventors could access the emotional dimensions of intellectual curiosity, leading to more inspired and intuitive approaches to research and problem solving. Mental health developed along completely different trajectories in a culture that valued emotional expression. The psychological problems that arise from bottled up feelings, depression, anxiety, anger disorders, addiction, were either much less common or took forms that were easier to address through community support and emotional skill development. Educational systems were designed around emotional as well as intellectual development. Children learned to recognize, understand, and work with their feelings as a fundamental life skill, just as important as reading, writing, and mathematics. This created adults who were more self-aware, more empathetic, and more capable of maintaining their own emotional well-being while supporting others. What if joy had been considered sacred? In your timeline, happiness is often treated as a pleasant but ultimately frivolous emotion, subordinate to more serious concerns like productivity, responsibility, and achievement. But in another timeline, joy was recognized as a fundamental spiritual experience, the emotion that connects individuals to the sacred dimensions of existence. Societies organized around the reverence for joy developed completely different priorities and institutions. Work was structured to maximize opportunities for fulfillment and delight, rather than merely to accomplish necessary tasks. Communities created elaborate festivals, celebrations, and rituals designed to cultivate collective joy and share it across all members of society. The sacred status of joy influenced how children were raised and educated. Instead of learning that play was a reward for completing serious work, children understood that joy was the natural state of a healthy consciousness, and that education should maintain and deepen their capacity for delight, rather than gradually diminishing it in service of adult responsibilities. Art, music, and literature in a joy-centered culture explored themes of beauty, wonder, and celebration, rather than primarily focusing on suffering, conflict, and tragedy. This didn't make their creative expression shallow or naive. Instead, they developed sophisticated understandings of how joy emerges from depth, how happiness connects to meaning, and how celebration can coexist with awareness of life's challenges. Scientific research was motivated by wonder and fascination, rather than by the desire to control or exploit natural phenomena. This led to different kinds of discoveries and innovations, technologies that enhanced rather than replaced natural processes, medicines that supported the body's innate healing capabilities, and tools that increased rather than diminished human connection to the natural world. Religious and spiritual practices centered around gratitude, appreciation, and the cultivation of bliss rather than around guilt, obligation, and the management of suffering. This created more psychologically healthy approaches to transcendence and more sustainable methods for maintaining spiritual well-being throughout life. What if loneliness had been visible? The internal experience of isolation and disconnection that affects so many individuals in your timeline became externally apparent in another reality, perhaps through changes in physical appearance, vocal quality, or even subtle energy fields that others could perceive. In that world, loneliness could not remain hidden, which meant it could not be ignored by communities. Societies developed sophisticated systems for recognizing when individuals were experiencing isolation and for providing the specific types of connection and support that could address their particular needs. Loneliness became a community health issue rather than a private suffering. The visibility of loneliness transformed how social structures were organized. Communities were designed to facilitate natural connection and belonging rather than leaving relationship formation to chance. Architecture, urban planning, and social institutions all reflected the understanding that human well-being depended on sustained meaningful contact with others. Educational systems taught social and emotional skills as rigorously as they taught academic subjects, recognizing that the ability to form and maintain relationships was as important as any intellectual capability. Children learned to recognize the signs of loneliness in themselves and others, and developed skills for creating inclusive communities where everyone could find belonging. The visibility of isolation also changed how individuals approached their own social needs. Instead of suffering silently, or pretending that independence was more important than connection, people could ask directly for the kinds of relationships and community involvement that would address their loneliness. This created more honest and more satisfying social interactions. Economic systems evolved to support community well-being rather than individual competition. Work was organized around teams and collaborative projects that fostered natural relationship formation. Living arrangements prioritized shared spaces and community interaction over private isolation. What if guilt had been treated rather than punished? In your timeline, guilt often becomes a chronic emotional state that people carry for years or decades. But in another timeline, guilt was recognized as a temporary signal that required attention and resolution, rather than a permanent burden to be endured. Communities developed sophisticated processes for helping individuals work through guilt productively. When people felt bad about their actions, they were guided through processes of understanding the impact of their behavior, making appropriate amends, learning from their mistakes, and releasing the emotional charge once the lesson had been integrated. This approach to guilt transformed both individual psychology and social justice systems. Instead of punishment designed to make people feel bad about their actions, communities created restorative processes that helped both offenders and victims heal from harmful incidents. Crime rates dropped dramatically because the conditions that typically led to repeated harmful behavior were addressed directly. The treatment of guilt also changed how creativity and innovation emerged. Without the fear of making mistakes that comes from unresolved guilt, people were more willing to experiment, take risks, and explore new possibilities. Scientific research advanced more rapidly because researchers could admit errors and learn from failures without carrying emotional burdens about their imperfections. Personal relationships were deeper and more resilient in a culture that knew how to process guilt effectively. Conflicts and misunderstandings were resolved quickly, because people had skills for acknowledging harm, making repairs, and moving forward without carrying resentment or shame. What if envy had been understood rather than judged? The emotion that drives much competition, resentment, and social conflict in your timeline was recognized in another timeline as valuable information about unmet needs and unexplored possibilities, rather than as a character flaw to be suppressed. When individuals felt envious of others' achievements, relationships, or circumstances, communities helped them explore what the envy was pointing toward, what they truly wanted, what they felt was missing from their own lives, what possibilities they hadn't yet pursued. Envy became a diagnostic tool for identifying areas where people needed support, resources, or encouragement to develop their own potential. This understanding transformed how societies approached inequality and social mobility. Instead of treating differences in achievement or circumstances as natural and inevitable, communities recognized that persistent envy often indicated structural problems that needed to be addressed. Resources were redistributed, and opportunities were created to ensure that everyone had access to the kinds of experiences and achievements that might otherwise generate destructive envy. Educational systems were designed to help each individual discover and develop their unique talents and interests, rather than forcing everyone to compete for the same limited opportunities. This reduced envy by ensuring that everyone had access to forms of achievement and recognition that matched their particular gifts and inclinations. The transformed understanding of envy also influenced how individuals approached their own desires and aspirations. Instead of feeling ashamed of wanting what others had, people learned to use envy as guidance for their own development and goal setting. This led to more authentic and more satisfying life choices. What if grief had been normalized from birth? In your timeline, loss and mourning are often treated as problems to be solved or emotions to be overcome. But in another timeline, grief was recognized as a natural and necessary part of human experience that deserved the same acceptance and support as any other fundamental life process. Children in that world grew up understanding that loving someone meant eventually experiencing the pain of losing them, and that this pain was not a design flaw, but an integral part of what made love meaningful. They learned skills for processing loss and supporting others through grief as naturally as they learned to walk and talk. Communities developed rich traditions and institutions for honouring grief and supporting people through the mourning process. Instead of expecting people to get over losses quickly and return to normal functioning, societies created space for the slow, non-linear process of integrating loss into a life that could still contain meaning and joy. The normalization of grief transformed how people approached love and attachment. Without the fear that loss would be unbearable, individuals could love more deeply and commit more fully to relationships and pursuits that mattered to them. The knowledge that grief was a normal part of life that they could handle effectively made them more willing to risk caring about things that might not last forever. Death itself was approached differently in a culture that understood grief as normal and necessary. End-of-life care focused on helping people complete their relationships and prepare their loved ones for the grieving process rather than on avoiding or denying the reality of death. This led to more peaceful and more meaningful transitions for both dying individuals and their survivors. What if love had always been the first option? In decisions both large and small, in responses to conflict and challenge, in approaches to problem-solving and relationship building, the question, "What would love do here?" was the starting point for consideration rather than an idealistic afterthought. This doesn't mean that practical concerns were ignored or that difficult decisions were avoided, but that the full spectrum of loving responses, including boundaries, consequences, and sometimes separation, was explored before other approaches were considered. Love was understood as including wisdom, discernment, and appropriate action, rather than just sentiment and acceptance. Societies organized around love as the primary value developed different approaches to governance, economics, and international relations. Policies were evaluated based on their impact on human flourishing and well-being rather than primarily on their economic efficiency or political expediency. International conflicts were approached through mediation and restoration rather than through dominance and punishment. Educational systems taught children to consider the loving option in every situation, while also developing their capacity to discern what genuine love looked like in complex circumstances. This created adults who could make difficult decisions from a foundation of care rather than fear, who could establish appropriate boundaries without abandoning compassion, and who could address harmful behaviour without dehumanising those who caused harm. The primacy of love also transformed how individuals approached their own development and choices. Personal goals were evaluated based on whether they emerged from love for themselves and others, rather than from fear, competition, or the need to prove worth. This led to more authentic and more sustainable approaches to growth and achievement. What if compassion had been humanity's first technology? Before the development of tools for manipulating the physical environment, human communities developed sophisticated technologies for understanding, sharing, and alleviating emotional and psychological suffering. Empathy became a refined skill with specific techniques and applications. In that timeline, the first innovations focused on consciousness rather than matter, methods for reading emotional states accurately, techniques for sharing experiences across individual boundaries, systems for coordinating group responses to individual distress. These technologies of compassion became the foundation for all other technological development. Scientific research was guided by compassionate intentions from its earlier stages, ensuring that new discoveries and innovations served human well-being rather than potentially causing harm. This didn't slow technological progress, but directed it toward applications that enhanced rather than threatened the conditions that support flourishing life. Social institutions were designed around compassionate principles, creating systems that could respond intelligently to human needs and suffering rather than simply managing behaviour through rewards and punishments. Governance became a practice of collective care rather than a mechanism for maintaining order through force. The development of compassion as a primary technology also influenced how conflicts and disagreements were resolved. Instead of approaching differences as problems to be won or lost, communities developed sophisticated methods for understanding all perspectives involved and finding solutions that honoured everyone's needs and concerns. These alternate emotional landscapes represent more than just different feelings. They represent different possibilities for human civilization itself, different answers to the fundamental questions about how conscious beings should relate to themselves, each other, and the challenges of existence. In each timeline, the cultivation and expression of different emotions shaped entirely different forms of culture, creating worlds that feel both recognizable and utterly foreign to your emotional experience. Your timeline's emotional patterns feel natural and inevitable because they are the only ones you've ever lived within, but they represent just one possible configuration of the vast spectrum of human feeling. The emotions that drive your world's conflicts, achievements, and relationships could have developed differently, creating civilizations based on entirely different emotional foundations. The future remains open to emotional evolution, as available for transformation as the patterns that shaped previous generations. You live at a moment when conscious choices about how to feel, express, and respond to emotions can still influence the kinds of worlds that become possible, the kinds of relationships that emerge between individuals and communities, and the kinds of experiences that define what it means to be human in an age when emotion and consciousness themselves are becoming subjects of technological enhancement and cultural design. You are not who you think you are. The identity you carry, your personality, your memories, your sense of what's possible and what's forbidden, your understanding of who you've been and who you might become, is not a fixed fact but a crystallized possibility, one specific way that consciousness could have organized itself, given the particular circumstances that shaped your development. In other timelines, other versions of you exist, carrying different names, different stories, different dreams, different fears, and entirely different understandings of what it means to be alive. These alternate selves are not distant theoretical constructs, but intimate possibilities that hover just beyond the edge of reality, separated from your actual existence by choices that seemed small at the time, circumstances that felt random, moments that passed so quickly you barely noticed them. They represent roads not taken, words not spoken, risks not accepted, invitations not extended, chances that slipped by while you were looking elsewhere. In those other timelines, you learned different lessons about who you could be, developed different talents, fell in love with different people, discovered different sources of meaning and purpose. You faced different challenges that revealed different aspects of your potential, lived in different places that awakened different parts of your consciousness, made different choices that led to entirely different versions of what you call your life. What if you had been born in another country? The geography of your birth, which feels like an unchangeable fact of your identity, represents just one possibility among the hundreds of places where your parents might have settled, where their parents might have emigrated, where the specific combination of circumstances that led to your existence might have aligned. In the timeline where your grandparents chose a different destination when they left their homeland, or where your parents met while living in a different city, or where a job opportunity took your family to a different continent, you grew up speaking different languages, absorbing different cultural values, learning different ways of understanding relationships, success, spirituality, and the purpose of human existence. The you that emerged from childhood in rural Japan developed a relationship with silence, nature, and seasonal change that shaped your creativity in ways that feel impossible to imagine from your current perspective. You learned to find beauty in subtlety, meaning in ritual, and wisdom in the spaces between words. Your art, your work, your approach to problem solving, and your understanding of time itself all emerged from a cultural foundation that valued patience, precision, and harmony with natural cycles. The version of you that grew up in a bustling Nigerian city learned to navigate complexity, community, and improvisation in ways that developed entirely different capacities. You became skilled at reading social dynamics, creating opportunities from limited resources, and finding joy in collaboration and collective celebration. Your career path, your relationship patterns, and your spiritual practices all emerged from a cultural environment that valued extended family, oral tradition, and the interconnectedness of individual and community well-being. The you that was raised in a small Canadian farming town developed a relationship with wide open spaces, harsh weather, and self-reliance that created a different kind of inner landscape. You learned to appreciate solitude, to work with your hands, to plan for long seasons of scarcity and abundance. Your personality developed around independence, practical problem solving, and a deep appreciation for the small pleasures that make isolated life sustainable and meaningful. Each of these geographic selves would feel completely natural and authentic from the inside, even though they would seem like different people entirely if you could meet them. The languages you think in, the foods that comfort you, the music that moves you, the social customs that feel normal, the career possibilities that seem realistic, all of these would be different, creating versions of you that share your essential consciousness but express it through entirely different cultural frameworks. What if you had never met your oldest friend? The relationship that has shaped your understanding of loyalty, trust, and companionship for years or decades never began because you attended a different school, lived in a different neighborhood, or simply happened to be absent on the day when the conversation started that led to connection. In that timeline, your social development followed different patterns. Without that particular friendship to model what deep connection looked like, you learned about relationships from other people who taught you different lessons about what it means to care for someone over time. Perhaps you became more independent, developing a stronger sense of individual identity, but less skill at emotional intimacy. Perhaps you became more socially adventurous, forming many casual connections instead of one deep one, learning to adapt to different personalities rather than growing with one person over time. The absence of that friendship changed how you handled conflict, disappointment, and the challenges of growing up. The specific way your oldest friend challenged you, supported you, and helped you understand yourself was replaced by different influences that shaped your character in subtly but significantly different directions. The inside jokes, shared references, and accumulated history that form the background of your current social interactions never developed, leaving space for different kinds of humour, different ways of communicating, and different sources of belonging and understanding. Your taste in music, movies, books, and activities was influenced by someone else's preferences, leading you to discover different artists, genres, and forms of entertainment that became the soundtrack and aesthetic framework for your adolescence and young adulthood. The person you became was shaped by different cultural inputs, different emotional experiences, and different models of what friendship could be. What if your name had been different? The label that others use to call your attention, that you write on forms and hear in introductions, that carries family history and parental hopes, shapes your sense of identity in ways that feel both trivial and profound. But names are chosen, and different choices would have created different relationships between you and the world. In the timeline where your parents selected a different name from their list of possibilities, you grew up with a different sound representing your identity, different associations and expectations from the people who met you, different ways of thinking about yourself. A name that was easier to pronounce might have made you more confident in social situations. A name that was more unusual might have taught you to stand out rather than blend in. A name with different cultural or historical associations might have influenced which role models appealed to you and which career paths seemed possible. The you with a different name developed a subtly different personality, not because names determine character, but because they influence how others respond to you and how you learn to respond to their responses. Teachers, employers, romantic interests, and new acquaintances all form first impressions based partly on names, and those first impressions create social dynamics that shape ongoing interactions in ways that accumulate over time into significant differences in life trajectory. Even your internal sense of self would be different with a different name. The sound you hear in your mind when you think about yourself, the way you sign documents, the particular combination of syllables that represents your individual existence in language, all of this would feel completely natural and authentic, even though it would represent a different version of your identity. What if you had said yes to that invitation? The opportunity you declined, whether from fear, scheduling conflicts, lack of interest, or simply because you were in a different mood that day, would have led to experiences that changed your trajectory in ways you never considered. Perhaps it was the invitation to a party where you would have met someone who became a lifelong friend, a romantic partner, or a professional mentor. Perhaps it was the suggestion to join a club, take a class, or attend an event that would have introduced you to interests and abilities you never discovered in your actual timeline. Perhaps it was the offer to travel somewhere, work on a project, or try something new that would have revealed aspects of yourself that remain hidden in your current life. In the timeline where you said yes, that evening, weekend, or experience became a turning point that redirected your understanding of what was possible, what was interesting, and what kinds of people and activities brought out your best qualities. The conversations you had, the challenges you faced, and the successes you achieved in that alternate experience taught you different lessons about your capabilities and preferences. The ripple effects of that yes extended far beyond the immediate experience. The confidence you gained from trying something new influenced your willingness to take other risks. The people you met became part of your social network, introducing you to opportunities that never arose in your actual timeline. The skills you developed, or the interests you discovered, led to different choices about education, career, relationships, and how to spend your time. What if you had never given up on that dream? The aspiration you abandoned, whether because it seemed impractical, because you encountered obstacles, because others discouraged you, or because you convinced yourself you weren't talented enough, continued to grow and develop in another timeline where you persisted despite the challenges. In that alternate reality, you found ways to overcome the barriers that stopped you in this timeline. You developed the skills you thought you lacked, discovered the opportunities you believed didn't exist, or simply maintained the passion that sustained you through the inevitable difficulties of pursuing something meaningful. The version of you that never gave up became the musician, writer, scientist, entrepreneur, or activist that you sometimes imagine you might have been. But the difference wasn't just in achieving that particular dream. It was in becoming the kind of person who doesn't give up on dreams. That persistence shaped your character in ways that influenced every other area of your life. You approached relationships with more commitment, career challenges with more creativity, and personal growth with more patience and determination. The confidence that came from proving to yourself that you could achieve difficult goals influenced how you responded to every subsequent opportunity and obstacle. The you that never gave up also influenced others differently. Your example inspired friends, family members, and colleagues to pursue their own abandoned dreams. Your willingness to take risks encouraged others to take their own risks. Your eventual success in your original dream field created opportunities for other people who might never have found those openings otherwise. What if you had stayed silent just once? The moment when you spoke up, whether to express disagreement, share an idea, ask a question, or make a request, remained a moment of internal consideration rather than external expression, in another timeline where you chose to keep your thoughts to yourself. Perhaps it was the time you corrected someone who was sharing inaccurate information, preventing them from continuing to operate under a false assumption that they then shared with others, eventually leading to better decisions and outcomes for many people. Perhaps it was the moment you spoke up in a meeting with an idea that changed the direction of a project, influenced a company's strategy, or solved a problem that had been frustrating everyone. In the timeline where you stayed silent, those positive changes never occurred, but other dynamics emerged instead. Your reputation developed around being a good listener rather than an active contributor. You became known for thoughtfulness and consideration, rather than for quick thinking and assertiveness. Your career path followed different routes that valued observation and analysis rather than leadership and innovation. The internal experience of choosing silence also shaped your character differently. You developed stronger skills at internal processing, became more comfortable with uncertainty and unresolved situations, and learned to influence situations through subtle actions rather than direct communication. Your relationships were shaped by different patterns of interaction that emphasized nonverbal communication and emotional attunement rather than verbal expression and debate. What if you had grown up loved differently? The particular ways that care, affection, attention, and support were expressed in your family created specific patterns in your nervous system, specific expectations about relationships, and specific beliefs about your own worth and lovability. But love takes countless forms, and different expressions of care would have shaped your development in entirely different directions. In the timeline where your parents expressed affection through adventure and exploration, rather than through security and stability, you developed a different relationship with risk, change, and the unknown. Your nervous system learned to associate love with excitement and discovery, rather than with predictability and comfort. You became an adult who sought growth and challenge in relationships rather than peace and harmony. The version of you that was raised by caregivers who emphasized intellectual development over emotional expression learned to understand love as a meeting of minds, rather than as emotional intimacy. You became skilled at connecting with others through shared interests, ideas, and projects, but less comfortable with vulnerability and emotional disclosure. Your romantic relationships and friendships were built around mental compatibility and mutual respect rather than emotional bonding and physical affection. The you that was raised in a family that expressed love through service and practical support, rather than through words and physical affection, developed a different emotional vocabulary entirely. You learned to recognize care through actions rather than expressions, to offer love through helping rather than through verbal affirmation, and to feel valued when others depended on your practical contributions, rather than when they praised your personal qualities. Each form of love created a different template for all future relationships, a different understanding of what care looks like, and a different set of skills for creating and maintaining connection with others. The adult you became carried forward the particular love language you learned as a child, seeking and offering affection in the specific ways that felt familiar and meaningful based on your early experiences. What if you had taken the risk? The opportunity that felt too dangerous, too uncertain, or too far outside your comfort zone was embraced in another timeline, where courage won over caution, where possibility felt more compelling than security, where you trusted your ability to handle whatever consequences emerged from bold action. Perhaps it was the chance to move to a different city for a job opportunity that wasn't guaranteed to work out. Perhaps it was the possibility of starting a business with limited savings and no assurance of success. Perhaps it was the invitation to enter a relationship with someone who lived in a different country, spoke a different language, or came from a very different background. In the timeline where you took the risk, You discovered capabilities you didn't know you possessed, resources you didn't know were available, and sources of support you hadn't expected to find. The challenges that seemed insurmountable from a distance proved manageable when approached with commitment and creativity. The fears that prevented you from acting in your actual timeline turned out to be based more on imagination than on reality. But more important than the specific outcomes of the risk was what taking it taught you about yourself and about life. You learned that you could handle uncertainty, adapt to change, and create security through your own resourcefulness rather than through avoiding challenges. This lesson influenced every subsequent decision, making you more willing to pursue opportunities, more confident in your ability to handle difficulties, and more trusting of your intuition about what was worth pursuing. What if you had left when you stayed? The situation you remained in, whether a relationship, a job, a living arrangement, or a community, was abandoned in another timeline where you chose departure over persistence, exploration over commitment, change over continuity. In that alternate reality, you discovered what lay beyond the familiar boundaries of your known world. You learned how other people lived, worked, and related to each other. You found out what you were capable of when removed from the context that had defined your identity for so long. You developed new skills, new perspectives, a new understanding of what was possible for your life. The experience of leaving also taught you different lessons about yourself and about relationships. You learned that you could survive separation from people and places that felt essential to your identity. You discovered that starting over wasn't as frightening or as difficult as you had imagined. You found out that you were more adaptable, more resourceful, and more capable of creating new connections than you had believed. But leaving also meant losing the particular benefits that staying provided. You missed the deepening that comes from working through challenges rather than avoiding them, the growth that emerges from commitment rather than from exploration, the satisfaction that develops from building something over time rather than from constantly seeking new experiences. What if this isn't your first life? In the timeline where consciousness continues from one existence to another, carrying forward accumulated wisdom, unresolved patterns and evolving purposes, your current life represents one chapter in a much longer story of development and learning. The skills that seemed to come naturally to you in childhood were abilities developed in previous lifetimes. The challenges that felt particularly difficult were patterns you came into this life specifically to resolve. The people you felt instantly connected to were souls you had known and loved and learned with in other incarnations. The work that felt most meaningful was a continuation of purposes you'd been pursuing across multiple lifetimes. This version of you carries a different relationship with mortality, difficulty, and purpose. Death is not an ending, but a transition, which changes how you approach risks, relationships, and the use of time. Challenges are not random hardships, but specifically chosen opportunities for growth, which changes how you respond to obstacles and setbacks. Relationships are not accidental encounters, but planned reunions with souls you have agreements to help and be helped by, which changes how you understand conflict, love, and separation. The you that remembers previous lives also carries different wisdom about human nature, social patterns, and the long arc of spiritual development. You can see how civilizations, relationships, and individual consciousness evolve over much longer timescales than a single human lifetime. This perspective influences how you respond to current events, personal difficulties, and the apparent injustices and inequalities of the world. These alternate versions of yourself are not fantasy figures or wishful thinking. They are the inevitable result of the countless variables that shaped your development, any of which could have been different, creating different outcomes, different personalities, different lives. They represent the vast space of possibility within which your actual existence emerged, the infinite potential that was narrowed down to this specific reality through the accumulation of choices, chances, and circumstances that fell exactly as they did rather than any of the countless ways they might have fallen differently. But recognizing these alternate selves is not an invitation to regret or to fantasize about different lives. It's a reminder that the same creative potential that could have generated those other versions of you is still available, still active, still capable of surprising you with new possibilities for growth, change, and self-discovery. You are not fixed in the patterns that have defined you so far. The person you have been is not the person you have to remain. The choices that shaped your past do not determine the choices available for your future. You live at the intersection of all your possible selves, with access to capabilities and potentials that may never have been expressed but have always been present, waiting for the right conditions, the right moment, the right willingness to allow them to emerge. The alternate yous exist not just in other timelines, but as dormant possibilities within your current existence, aspects of your potential that could still be awakened, developed, and integrated into who you are becoming. The person reading these words carries within themselves the seeds of all the people they might yet become, all the ways consciousness could still organize itself through the vehicle of your particular life, all the futures that remain available for creation through the choices you make from this moment forward, the natural world that surrounds you, the weight that holds you to the earth, the color that paints the sky, the rhythm that governs your sleep, the force that warms your skin, feels so fundamental that questioning it seems like questioning reality itself. But the laws of physics, the biological processes, and the environmental conditions that define your existence represent just one possible configuration of how matter and energy could organize themselves into a universe capable of supporting consciousness and life. In other timelines, the fundamental constants that govern reality settled into different values during the first moments after creation, creating universes where the basic rules of existence operate according to entirely different principles. The creatures that evolved in those worlds developed senses adapted to different spectrums of light, different gravitational fields, different atmospheric compositions, and different relationships between space, time, and the flow of energy through living systems. These alternate natures would seem miraculous and impossible from your perspective, but they would feel completely normal and inevitable to the beings who evolved within them. The way consciousness experiences reality is shaped by the particular physical conditions within which it emerges, creating different forms of awareness, different ways of being alive, and different understandings of what existence means when filtered through entirely different biological and environmental frameworks. What if gravity had been weaker? The force that keeps you pressed against the surface of the planet, that determines how water flows and how objects fall, that shapes the formation of stars and the structure of galaxies, operated with less intensity in another timeline where the fundamental constants of physics settled into different values during the universe's first moments of existence. In that world, creatures evolved very different relationships with vertical space and movement. Humans could leap enormous distances with minimal effort, bound across landscapes in graceful arcs that would seem like flying to someone from your timeline. Buildings were constructed as delicate, soaring structures that reached impossible heights without the engineering challenges that strong gravity creates. Transportation developed around principles of momentum and gliding rather than overcoming gravitational resistance. The weaker gravitational field also meant that planets retained thicker atmospheres, and that smaller worlds could maintain the conditions necessary for complex life. The solar system contained many more habitable worlds, leading to earlier space travel and the development of interplanetary civilization. The reduced weight of everything meant that launching spacecraft required much less energy, making space exploration as common as ocean travel became in your timeline. But perhaps the most profound difference was in how creatures experienced their own embodiment. Bodies developed differently when they didn't need to constantly resist strong gravitational pull. Bones were lighter and more flexible. Muscles were designed for graceful movement rather than strength against constant downward force. And the cardiovascular system didn't need to work as hard to circulate blood throughout the body. The psychology of beings who could easily defy gravity was different as well. The metaphors they used for thinking about problems and possibilities were based on effortless rising rather than effortful climbing. Their spiritual concepts emphasized levity and transcendence rather than grounding and stability. Their art and architecture celebrated lightness, movement, and the joy of floating rather than the dignity of weight and the beauty of solid construction. Even their understanding of effort and achievement was shaped by the reduced gravitational resistance. Since physical tasks required less force, they developed more refined appreciation for subtlety, precision, and grace rather than for power and endurance. Their competitive activities emphasized agility and creativity rather than strength and persistence. What if the sky had been green? The atmospheric composition that scatters light in your timeline created blue skies and red sunsets. But in another timeline, different gases and particles in the atmosphere interacted with starlight to paint the heavens in an entirely different palette of colours. Creatures that evolved under green skies developed visual systems optimized for different wavelengths of light. Their eyes were sensitive to colour spectrum that your vision can't perceive, while being less sensitive to the colours that seem most vivid to you. This didn't make their vision inferior, it was simply adapted to the light conditions of their world, allowing them to see details and distinctions that would be invisible to you. The green sky influenced every aspect of their aesthetic development. Their art, clothing, architecture, and decoration all emerged from a completely different baseline understanding of what colours were harmonious, what combinations were pleasing, and what visual effects were possible. The green atmosphere created different patterns of shadows and illumination throughout the day, leading to different rhythms of activity and rest. Plant life evolved differently under the green sky as well. Photosynthesis operated according to different principles, leading to vegetation that appeared in colours and forms that would seem alien to your expectations. Flowers, fruits, and leaves developed hues and patterns adapted to attract pollinators and dispersers whose vision was tuned to the green sky light spectrum. The psychological and cultural effects of the green sky were subtle but pervasive. The beings who grew up under green heavens associated different emotions and meanings with various colours. Their languages developed different words for colour distinctions that were important in their world but unnecessary in yours. Their spiritual and philosophical traditions used different metaphors based on the particular beauty of green atmospheric effects. Even their understanding of weather and seasons was shaped by how different meteorological conditions affected the green coloration of their sky. Storms, clear days, dawn, and dusk all created different visual experiences that influenced their poetry, their timekeeping systems, and their relationship with natural cycles. What if humans had never stood upright? The evolutionary development that freed your ancestors' hands for tool use and changed their perspective from horizontal to vertical never occurred in another timeline where different environmental pressures and random mutations led bipedal locomotion to remain disadvantageous or impossible. In that world, humans remained quadrupedal, but developed intelligence through different evolutionary pathways. Their hands evolved into more sophisticated manipulative organs, while still serving locomotion functions, leading to tools and technologies that were designed around four-limbed body plans. Their societies developed around different spatial arrangements that emphasized horizontal rather than vertical organization. Architecture in that timeline was fundamentally different, designed for beings who moved and lived closer to the ground. Cities were built as networks of tunnels, low chambers, and horizontal pathways rather than as collections of tall buildings and vertical structures. Transportation systems were designed around four-limbed movement patterns, creating entirely different approaches to covering distance and navigating terrain. The psychological and cultural implications of remaining quadrupedal were profound. These humans developed different relationships with the landscape, different understandings of perspective and scale, and different metaphors for thinking about hierarchy, achievement, and aspiration. Their spiritual traditions emphasize connection to the earth, rather than reaching toward the sky, integration with natural systems rather than transcendence of them. Their sensory experience of the world was also different. Being closer to the ground meant more intimate contact with scents, textures, and vibrations that your upright ancestors learned to ignore. This led to richer appreciation for subtle environmental information and more sophisticated communication systems based on chemical signals and ground-transmitted vibrations. The social structures they developed were influenced by their four-limbed body plans as well. Without the clear height-based hierarchies that standing upright enables, their societies organized around different principles of leadership, cooperation, and social organization. Status was determined by different criteria, and power was expressed through different means. What if humans age backwards? the biological clock that governs cellular repair, growth and deterioration in your timeline, operated in reverse in another reality, where beings were born ancient and gradually became younger, stronger, and more capable as they moved through their lifespans. In that world, individuals began life with the accumulated wisdom of old age but the physical limitations of elderly bodies. They started their existence knowing vast amounts about the world, relationships, and the consequences of various choices, but lacking the physical energy and capability to act on that knowledge immediately. As they aged backwards, they gradually gained strength, speed, and physical beauty, while slowly losing the wisdom and memory that they had possessed at birth. This reverse aging created entirely different life patterns and social structures. The youngest members of society were the most physically capable, but also the most naive and impulsive, while the oldest members were the most wise but also the most physically limited. Education operated according to different principles, focusing on preserving and transmitting the knowledge that individuals naturally lost as they grew younger, rather than on accumulating new information over time. Relationships formed under very different dynamics, when partners were moving in opposite directions along the aging spectrum. The question of when to have children became complex when considering that offspring would be born with more life experience than their parents would eventually possess. Career planning required thinking about gradually decreasing rather than increasing capabilities over time. The psychological experience of reverse aging was profound as well. Instead of facing mortality as an inevitable future, beings in that timeline experienced mortality as a gradually receding past. The approach toward death was replaced by the approach toward birth, a return to innocence, physical vitality, and the immediate experience of existence without the burden of accumulated memory and regret. Their philosophies and spiritual traditions developed around the idea that wisdom was a temporary gift that consciousness carried briefly before returning to pure experience. Their literature and art explored themes of forgetting rather than remembering, of simplification rather than complexity, of return rather than progress. What if animals could vote? The cognitive capabilities that allow for complex decision-making, moral reasoning and political participation developed in many species rather than just in humans, creating ecosystems where multiple forms of intelligence contributed to environmental management and resource allocation decisions. In that timeline, early human civilizations developed alongside other intelligent species rather than dominating them. Political systems included representation for various animal communities, with translation technologies that allowed different forms of consciousness to communicate about shared concerns like territory use, resource distribution, and environmental protection. The dolphins contributed oceanic perspectives to coastal management decisions. The elephants provided long-term memory about climate patterns and migration routes. The corvids offered aerial surveillance data and complex problem-solving insights. The great apes brought forest management expertise and sophisticated social organization knowledge. This multi-species democracy led to very different approaches to agriculture, urban planning, and industrial development. Human technologies were designed to integrate with, rather than disrupt, natural systems, since the affected animal communities had political power to prevent harmful developments. Environmental protection wasn't an abstract moral principle, but a practical necessity for maintaining interspecies political cooperation. The legal systems that developed in multi-species societies were far more complex than anything your timeline has created, with different courts and legal procedures adapted to different forms of consciousness and communication. Concepts of property, consent, and justice were redefined to account for the perspectives and needs of many different kinds of minds. Scientific research advanced much more rapidly when human investigators could collaborate directly with animal subjects who could report their own experiences, preferences, and observations. Medicine, psychology, and ecology all benefited enormously from direct input from non-human consciousness about their own functioning and environmental relationships. What if trees whispered their names? The plant kingdom developed sophisticated communication systems that allowed individual trees to identify themselves and share information about their experiences, needs, and observations with other plants and with any animals capable of learning their language. forests became vast networks of information sharing, with older trees serving as repositories of environmental knowledge that they could transmit to younger plants and to any humans who learned to understand their communication systems. Each tree carried a unique identity, a personal history, and a distinctive perspective on the changes occurring in their environment over the decades or centuries of their existence. Human societies that developed alongside speaking trees created entirely different relationships with forests and agriculture. Farming became a collaborative process where crop plants could communicate their needs for water, nutrients, and pest control. Forestry developed into a form of interspecies diplomacy, where tree communities could negotiate which individuals were willing to sacrifice themselves for human needs and which areas needed to remain undisturbed. The speaking trees also served as long-term memory systems for human communities, preserving stories, wisdom, and historical knowledge across many human generations. Libraries were living forests where different trees specialized in maintaining different categories of information that they could share with human scholars who knew how to ask the right questions. Architecture and urban planning evolved around the preferences and needs of tree communities that were recognized as legitimate inhabitants with their own rights and interests. Cities became collaborations between human and plant consciousness, with trees serving as living infrastructure that could adapt and respond to changing conditions. What if the ocean glowed from below? Bioluminescent organisms filled the marine environment with natural light that emanated from the depths, creating underwater landscapes that were as visually rich and complex as terrestrial environments illuminated by sunlight. Marine life evolved sophisticated visual communication systems based on patterns of light production and detection. Ocean creatures developed the equivalent of written languages using controlled bioluminescence, creating underwater civilizations with their own literature, art, and scientific knowledge preserved in light-based information systems. Coastal human societies developed entirely different relationships with the ocean when it was a visible, illuminated environment rather than a dark mystery. Maritime exploration and underwater agriculture began much earlier because the glowing ocean allowed humans to see and navigate underwater environments effectively. Diving and underwater construction technologies advanced rapidly when the work could be performed in naturally illuminated conditions. The psychological and cultural impact of glowing oceans was enormous. Instead of representing the unknown and the dangerous, the sea became a visible realm of beauty and wonder. Maritime cultures developed rich traditions of underwater art appreciation, submarine architecture, and deep-sea tourism. The boundary between terrestrial and marine life became much more permeable. The glowing ocean also influenced global climate and weather patterns in ways that affected terrestrial life. The underwater light affected ocean currents, temperature distributions, and the behavior of marine organisms in ways that create different patterns of evaporation, precipitation, and seasonal change on land. What if fire burned cold? The chemical process that produces heat and light through combustion operated according to different principles in another timeline, where fire could exist at low temperatures while still providing illumination and the ability to transform materials. Civilizations that developed around cold fire created entirely different technologies and social practices. Cooking became a process that could occur at room temperature, leading to different relationships with food preservation, nutrition, and meal preparation. Architecture didn't need to account for the heat and fire hazards that shaped building design in your timeline, allowing for different construction materials and techniques. The development of metallurgy and manufacturing followed completely different pathways when heat wasn't required for melting and shaping materials. Cold fire could still provide the energy needed for chemical transformations, but without the dangerous temperatures that limited who could work with fire and where such work could be performed safely. Social gatherings around cold fire created different kinds of communal experiences. Campfires and hearths provided light and a focal point for group activities without the warmth that shapes how people position themselves and interact around fires in your timeline. The symbolism and spiritual significance of fire developed along different lines when it wasn't associated with heat, danger, and the dramatic transformation of materials. The absence of fire as a heat source led to different solutions for staying warm in cold climates, different approaches to lighting interior spaces, and different relationships with seasonal cycles. Human societies developed more sophisticated techniques for passive solar heating, thermal mass, and insulation, rather than relying on combustion for warmth. What if sleep weren't real? The daily cycle of consciousness and unconsciousness that occupies roughly 1/3 of your existence never evolved in another timeline where intelligent beings remained continuously awake throughout their entire lifespans. Without the need for sleep, these creatures developed entirely different relationships with time, productivity, and mental health. Their days weren't divided into periods of activity and rest, but flowed continuously through various states of focus, relaxation, and engagement without the sharp transitions that sleep creates in your timeline. Architecture and urban planning evolved around continuous activity rather than the cyclical patterns that sleeping creates. Cities didn't have quiet nighttime hours or the infrastructure needed to support people during their vulnerable sleeping periods. Social activities and work schedules operated on different rhythms based on attention spans and energy cycles, rather than on the sleep-wake cycle. The absence of dreams meant that these beings processed information, integrated memories, and accessed unconscious creativity through different mechanisms. Their art, literature, and problem-solving techniques developed around continuous conscious processing rather than the insights and inspiration that often emerge from dream states. Mental health and psychological development followed different patterns without sleep to provide regular periods of reduced consciousness and mental processing. These beings needed different techniques for managing stress, processing emotions, and maintaining cognitive function across their continuously active lifespans. Their understanding of consciousness itself was different as well, since they never experienced the altered states that sleep and dreaming provide in your timeline. Their philosophies and spiritual traditions developed around continuous awareness, rather than the cycle of conscious and unconscious states that shapes much of human thinking about the nature of mind and reality. These alternate natures represent more than just different physical conditions. They represent different possibilities for what consciousness could experience, different frameworks within which awareness could develop and explore the nature of existence. Each changed physical law, biological process, or environmental condition would create entirely different forms of life, different ways of being conscious, and different understandings of what it means to be alive in a universe where matter and energy organize themselves according to different principles. Your timeline's natural world feels inevitable because it's the only one you've ever experienced, but it represents just one possible answer to the question of how physics, chemistry, and biology could combine to create conditions that support complex life and conscious awareness. The natural laws that govern your existence could have been different, creating universes where consciousness explores reality through entirely different sensory capabilities, physical constraints, and environmental relationships. The future remains open to natural transformation as well, as human technology begins to modify physical laws on local scales, as genetic engineering reshapes biological processes, and as space exploration encounters environments where different conditions create different possibilities for life and consciousness. You live at a moment when the boundary between natural and artificial is becoming permeable, when the laws of nature themselves are becoming subjects of conscious design rather than unchangeable constraints on what forms of existence are possible. Language is not a transparent window through which consciousness observes reality. It is the architecture of thought itself, shaping what can be conceived, what can be communicated, and what can be understood about the nature of existence. Every word you think creates pathways in your mind that determine which ideas feel possible, which emotions feel expressible, and which aspects of experience feel real enough to share with others. The particular language system that emerged in your timeline, with its specific vocabulary, grammar, and conceptual frameworks, represents just one possible solution to the challenge of encoding experience into symbols that can travel between minds. In other timelines, different approaches to creating meaning through sound, symbol, and shared understanding developed, creating entirely different relationships between consciousness and communication, between individual experience and collective knowledge. These alternate languages don't just offer different words for the same concepts. They create different concepts entirely, different ways of passing reality into meaningful categories, different methods for thinking about time, space, identity, causation, and the relationships that connect all things. They represent different answers to the fundamental questions about what kinds of meanings are worth preserving, what kinds of experiences deserve names, and how consciousness can most effectively share itself across the boundaries that separate individual minds. What if there had been 100 words for love? Instead of the single term that carries the overwhelming burden of representing every form of care, affection, attraction, devotion, and connection in your language, another timeline developed a sophisticated vocabulary that distinguished between the many different experiences that all fall under the simple label love in your world. In that linguistic reality, there were specific words for the love that emerges between friends who have survived difficulty together, different from the love that develops between people who inspire each other's creativity, different again from the love that forms between those who share similar wounds or similar dreams. There were words for the love that feels peaceful and sustainable, distinct from the love that feels passionate and transformative, distinct from the love that feels protective and nurturing. This rich vocabulary for love didn't just provide more precise communication, it created more precise experience. When speakers of that language noticed affection arising in their hearts, they could identify exactly which type of love they were feeling, which allowed them to understand its particular gifts and challenges, its natural development patterns, and its appropriate expressions. Relationships developed differently when people could name the specific form of love they shared. Instead of confusion about whether feelings were strong enough or the right kind, people could recognize and appreciate the particular quality of connection they had discovered together. This prevented many relationships from ending due to mismatched expectations, and helped many others deepen into forms of love that were appropriately expressed and nurtured. The society that grew up with 100 words for love also developed more sophisticated institutions for supporting different kinds of relationships. Marriage customs evolved to honor various forms of long-term commitment. Friendship rituals celebrated different levels and types of connection. Community structures were designed to facilitate the many different ways that people could meaningfully care for each other. Their literature, philosophy, and spiritual traditions explored love with a precision and depth that your language struggles to achieve. Poetry could capture subtle distinctions between emotional experiences that your timeline can only describe through elaborate metaphors and lengthy explanations. Philosophy could examine specific aspects of human connection without the confusion that comes from using one word to represent dozens of different experiences. What if no one could lie? Not even once. The capacity for deception that shapes so much of human interaction, politics, and social organization never developed in another timeline where neurological or cultural evolution made intentional falsehood impossible for human beings to produce or process. In that world, all communication was necessarily honest, but honesty took many sophisticated forms. People learned to express difficult truths with kindness, to share uncomfortable observations with compassion, and to discuss disagreements without attacking each other's character or intentions. The social skills that developed around truthful communication were far more refined than anything your timeline has achieved. Political systems operated according to completely different principles, when no politician could make false promises, when no leader could conceal their real motivations, when no government could mislead citizens about the consequences of policies or the reasons for decisions. Democracy became a much more informed and more functional system when voters had access to truthful information from all candidates and officials. Business and economics evolved differently as well. Without the possibility of fraud, misrepresentation, or false advertising, markets operated with much greater efficiency and fairness. Trust was no longer a scarce commodity that had to be carefully earned and verified. It was the natural foundation for all commercial and professional relationships. The absence of lying also transformed intimate relationships. People learned to share their authentic thoughts and feelings skillfully, rather than hiding them behind comfortable deceptions. Marriages and friendships were built on genuine knowledge of each other rather than on carefully managed impressions. Conflicts were resolved more quickly because everyone's real concerns and motivations were apparent from the beginning. But perhaps the most profound change was in how individuals related to themselves. Without the ability to lie to others, people also lost the ability to lie to themselves through denial, rationalization, and self-deception. This created a culture of remarkable self-awareness and emotional honesty, where people faced their own motivations, fears, and desires with clarity and acceptance. What if everyone dreamed in the same language? The private, personal experience of sleep consciousness became a shared cultural phenomenon, and another timeline where dreams occurred in a common symbolic vocabulary that all humans could understand and interpret. In that world, dreams served as a form of collective communication and problem solving. Important community decisions were made through dream councils, where groups of people would sleep together and compare the guidance that emerged from their shared dream symbolism. Scientific discoveries often began with insights that appeared in the dreams of multiple researchers simultaneously. The common dream language also created new forms of art, literature, and entertainment. Dream narratives became a recognized art form, with skilled dreamers who could create beautiful or meaningful dream experiences for others to share. Libraries contained collections of recorded dreams organized by theme, symbolism, and emotional content. Education incorporated dream experiences as a fundamental part of learning. Students could explore historical events, scientific concepts, and philosophical ideas through carefully constructed dream scenarios that made abstract knowledge viscerally experiential. Language learning occurred through dreams where students could practice conversation, in environments where linguistic mistakes had no consequences. The shared dream language also provided new approaches to therapy and healing. Psychological problems could be addressed through therapeutic dreams where individuals could safely experience and resolve emotional conflicts. Trauma could be processed through dream environments designed to provide healing and integration. But the most significant impact was on how people understood consciousness itself. Dreams were no longer private mysteries, but shared explorations of the mind's capacity to create meaning, beauty, and insight. The boundary between individual and collective consciousness became more permeable, creating communities that were more deeply connected and more capable of true empathy and understanding. What if people couldn't name emotions, only feel them? The elaborate vocabulary for internal states that allows you to categorize, analyze, and communicate about feelings never developed in another timeline, where emotions remained purely experiential phenomena without linguistic labels or conceptual frameworks. In that world, people experienced the full spectrum of human feeling with remarkable intensity and clarity. But they related to emotions more like music or colour, as rich experiences to be felt and appreciated rather than as problems to be analysed and solved. Without words to freeze emotions into fixed categories, feelings were experienced as flowing, changing, dynamic processes. Social interaction developed around much more sophisticated forms of emotional attunement and non-verbal communication. People learned to read each other's feeling states with extraordinary precision and to respond empathetically without needing to verbalize what they were observing. Communities developed strong emotional coherence without the fragmentation that can come from emotional analysis and categorization. Art, music, and creative expression became the primary vehicles for sharing and exploring emotional experience. Instead of talking about feelings, people created sounds, movements, colors, and forms that embodied and transmitted emotional states. This led to much more sophisticated aesthetic traditions and more powerful artistic expressions than societies that relied primarily on verbal processing of emotions. The absence of emotional labeling also influenced how people approached mental health and personal development. Instead of trying to understand and solve emotional problems intellectually, they learned to work with feelings directly through embodied practices, creative expression, and community support. This led to more effective healing processes and more sustainable emotional well-being. Without emotional vocabulary, people also developed different relationships with the complexity and paradox of human feeling. Instead of trying to resolve contradictory emotions through analysis, they learned to hold multiple feelings simultaneously without needing to choose between them or make them make sense rationally. What if people spoke in color instead of sound? Communication evolved through visual rather than auditory channels in another timeline, where human perception and expression developed along different pathways, creating languages based on patterns of light and colour rather than combinations of sounds. In that world, conversations occurred through rapid displays of coloured light produced by specialised organs that evolved for communication purposes. Different hues represented different concepts, while patterns, intensity and movement conveyed grammar, emotion and emphasis. Complex ideas were expressed through elaborate light shows that were as beautiful as they were informative. Architecture and city planning developed around the needs of visual communication. Buildings were designed with surfaces that could display and reflect coloured light effectively. Public spaces included facilities for large group communication through coordinated light displays. Privacy required different approaches when conversations were visible rather than audible. The light-based language also influenced how people thought about ideas and relationships. Concepts were associated with specific colours and visual patterns, creating mental processes that were more spatial and aesthetic than linear and temporal. Memory techniques developed around visual organisation rather than verbal repetition. Art and entertainment merged completely with language in a culture where communication itself was a visual medium. Poetry became choreographed light, and conversation became a form of collaborative visual art. The distinction between communication and aesthetic expression disappeared entirely. The society that communicated through colour also developed different approaches to privacy, intimacy, and social interaction. Conversations could be observed from a distance, but they could also be beautiful to watch even when the specific meaning wasn't understood. This created new forms of community entertainment and social bonding around the appreciation of communication as visual art. What if silence was a sacred language? Instead of being merely the absence of sound, silence developed as a sophisticated communication system, with its own vocabulary, grammar, and cultural significance. Different qualities of silence conveyed different meanings, and skilled practitioners could hold complex conversations without making any audible sounds. Communities that spoke silence developed extraordinarily refined attention to subtle environmental sounds, internal states, and the energy dynamics between people. Silence conversations occurred through careful attention to breathing patterns, micro-movements, and the felt sense of presence that exists between individuals when they're deeply attuned to each other. Religious and spiritual traditions were built around silence as the most profound form of communication with the sacred. Meditation practices developed into elaborate silent dialogues with ultimate reality. Prayer became a form of listening rather than speaking, and the deepest spiritual insights were transmitted through shared silence rather than through words or texts. Educational systems taught silence literacy alongside verbal literacy. Children learned to communicate complex ideas, emotions, and information through various forms of intentional quiet. Advanced practitioners could hold detailed conversations about technical, philosophical, and artistic topics without ever making a sound. The sacred status of silence also influenced how verbal communication was understood and practiced. Words were used more carefully and sparingly when silence was recognized as equally valid and often more profound than speech. This created cultures where verbal communication was more precise, more meaningful, and more respectful than in societies where talking was the primary mode of interaction. What if stories were currency? Narrative became the medium of economic exchange in another timeline, where the ability to create, preserve, and transmit compelling stories was valued more highly than the accumulation of material goods or abstract tokens of wealth. In that economy, people earned their living by creating stories that others wanted to hear, preserve, and retell. Wealth was measured in the richness of one's story collection and the skill with which one could craft new narratives. Trade occurred through the exchange of stories, with different types of narratives having different values based on their rarity, beauty, and usefulness. The story-based economy created very different incentives for human behavior and development. Instead of pursuing activities that generated money, people focused on living lives that would create interesting stories. This led to more adventurous, more creative, and more meaningful lifestyle choices, as everyone was motivated to accumulate experiences worth sharing. Education evolved around storytelling skills and narrative analysis. Children learned to craft compelling narratives as the most important life skill, more essential than mathematics or traditional literacy. Advanced practitioners could create stories so valuable that they could trade them for houses, land, or a lifetime of material support. The storytelling economy also influenced how communities preserved and transmitted knowledge. Instead of libraries of books, societies maintained collections of stories that contained technical information, historical records, and wisdom teachings embedded in narrative forms that were easier to remember and more engaging to share. Legal systems operated through narrative rather than abstract principles. Justice was determined by the quality of the stories that different parties could tell about their actions and motivations. Laws themselves were preserved as stories that illustrated proper behaviour through example, rather than through rules. What if language had never existed at all? Communication between humans remained entirely non-verbal in another timeline, where the specific cognitive and physiological developments that enable symbolic language never emerged, leading to entirely different forms of consciousness and community organisation. In that world, humans developed extraordinary sophistication in non-verbal communication, emotional attunement, and direct mind-to-mind connection. Without words to mediate their understanding of reality, they experienced existence more directly, more immediately, and with less conceptual filtering than language-using beings. Art, music, and movement became the primary vehicles for sharing complex ideas and cultural knowledge. Technical information was transmitted through elaborate demonstration and apprenticeship systems. Philosophy and abstract thinking occurred through artistic expression and contemplative practices that bypassed verbal conceptualization entirely. The absence of language led to different forms of consciousness and memory. Without words to organize and categorize experience, people developed more holistic, more intuitive, and more embodied ways of processing information. Memory worked more like music or dance than like verbal storage and retrieval systems. Community organization evolved around direct empathetic connection, rather than through verbal negotiation and rulemaking. Decisions were made through collective sensing into what felt right for the group as a whole. Conflicts were resolved through non-verbal processes that addressed the emotional and energetic dimensions of disagreement, rather than the conceptual or logical aspects. Without language to create the illusion of separation between self and world, these humans maintained stronger connection to their environment and to each other. Their cultures developed around harmony with natural systems rather than abstract concepts about how reality should be organized and managed. What if every word you said left a visible mark? Language became a physical phenomenon in another timeline, where spoken words materialized as tangible objects, or visible traces that accumulated in the environment, creating a world where the consequences of speech were immediately apparent and permanently recorded. In that reality, people learned to speak much more carefully and thoughtfully, knowing that their words would leave lasting traces that others could observe and evaluate. Conversations created visible art in the space where they occurred, with different emotions, intentions, and types of content producing different colours, shapes, and patterns in the accumulated word marks. Homes and public spaces were designed around the aesthetic impact of accumulated speech. Beautiful conversations created environments that were pleasant to inhabit, while harsh or dishonest communication left ugly traces that made spaces uncomfortable. This created strong incentives for kind, truthful, and beautiful speech in all settings. The visible nature of words also influenced how communities approached education, justice, and social organisation. Children could see the impact of their words on their environment, learning to communicate more skillfully from an early age. Legal proceedings were influenced by the visible evidence of how people had spoken about various topics over time. Poetry and artistic speech became forms of environmental design, with skilled speakers able to create beautiful word marks that enhanced the aesthetic appeal of public spaces. Libraries and schools were designed around collections of beautiful speech that had been preserved for their visual as well as their communicative value. The permanent visibility of speech also changed how people approach privacy, intimacy, and personal development. Since all communication left traces, people developed more sophisticated practices around when to speak and when to remain silent. what kinds of speech were appropriate for different settings, and how to create speech that was both truthful and beautiful. What if humans could understand animals? The communication barriers between species were dissolved in another timeline, where humans developed the cognitive and perceptual abilities necessary to comprehend the complex languages that animals already used among themselves. In that world, human civilization developed in constant dialogue with other forms of consciousness. Dogs could explain their emotional experiences and needs directly. Cats could share their philosophical insights about independence and pleasure. Birds could provide weather predictions and ecological observations from their aerial perspectives. Agriculture and animal husbandry evolved into collaborative partnerships rather than systems of domestication and control. Farm animals could negotiate their working conditions and communicate their preferences about care, breeding, and living arrangements. Wild animals could share information about environmental changes and ecosystem health that informed human decision-making about land use and conservation. Scientific research was revolutionized by the ability to interview animal subjects about their experiences. Medical research involving animals became ethically transformed when animals could provide informed consent and detailed feedback about treatments and procedures. Behavioral studies gained access to animal perspectives on their own motivations and social dynamics. The legal and ethical frameworks that governed human-animal relationships were completely restructured when animals could advocate for themselves and participate in decisions that affected their welfare. Environmental policy was influenced by direct input from the species that would be impacted by various development and conservation decisions. Perhaps most profoundly, human understanding of consciousness itself was expanded by direct access to animal perspectives on existence, meaning, and the nature of awareness. Philosophy and spirituality were enriched by insights from forms of consciousness that experience reality through different sensory systems and different cognitive frameworks. These alternate approaches to language and meaning represent different possibilities for how consciousness can encode, share, and evolve its understanding of reality. Each linguistic system creates different relationships between mind and world, between individual and community, between present experience and accumulated knowledge. Your timeline's language feels natural and inevitable because it's the only one you've ever used for thinking and communicating, but it represents just one possible solution to the challenge of sharing consciousness across the boundaries that separate individual minds. The words you think, the concepts you can conceive, and the meanings you can create are all shaped by the particular linguistic inheritance you received from previous generations. The future remains open to linguistic evolution, as technology begins to enable new forms of communication that transcend traditional speech and writing, as contact with artificial intelligence creates hybrid forms of human-machine language, and as global connectivity creates pressure for more universal and more precise forms of cross-cultural communication. You live at a moment when language itself is becoming a subject of conscious design rather than unconscious evolution, when the tools for creating meaning are themselves becoming tools that consciousness can deliberately modify and improve. The invisible dimensions of existence, the aspects of reality that lie beyond the reach of physical senses and scientific instruments, represent the most mysterious territory in any timeline. The realm where consciousness encounters questions that rational analysis cannot resolve, and experiences that material explanations cannot fully contain. In your timeline, these spiritual mysteries remain tantalizingly hidden, accessible only through faith, intuition, and the subjective reports of those who claim to have touched something beyond the ordinary boundaries of human understanding. But in other timelines, the membrane between visible and invisible, between known and unknown, between material and spiritual developed differently. The same fundamental questions about meaning, purpose, consciousness, and transcendence that characterize human spiritual seeking receive different answers, or revealed themselves through different forms of evidence, creating civilizations where the relationship between scientific and spiritual knowledge followed entirely different evolutionary paths. These alternate spiritual realities don't just offer different beliefs about the same mysteries, they represent different configurations of mystery itself, different ways that consciousness could encounter the ultimate questions of existence. different possibilities for what kinds of spiritual knowledge might be accessible to beings who developed more sophisticated methods for exploring the invisible dimensions of reality. What if there had been proof of the soul? The persistent intuition that consciousness extends beyond the physical brain and survives bodily death received concrete, measurable scientific verification in another timeline where the instruments and methodologies needed to detect and study spiritual phenomena developed alongside material science. In that world, the existence of souls was as well established as the existence of electromagnetic fields in your timeline. Scientific instruments could measure soul energy, track its movements, and observe its interactions with physical matter. Medical devices could detect when souls departed bodies at death, and sometimes observe them remaining in proximity to their former physical forms. This empirical validation of soul existence transformed every aspect of human civilization. Death became understood as a transition rather than an ending, fundamentally altering how people approach mortality, grief, and the meaning of life. Medical practice evolved to include soul healing alongside physical treatment, recognizing that complete health required attention to spiritual as well as material dimensions of human existence. Legal systems had to grapple with questions about the rights and responsibilities of souls that could be proven to persist after bodily death. Inheritance laws became complex when deceased individuals could sometimes communicate their preferences about how their possessions should be distributed. Criminal justice was complicated by evidence that murder victims sometimes remained present to testify about their own deaths. Education included spiritual development as rigorously as intellectual training, since soul cultivation was recognized as essential for complete human development. Children learned techniques for perceiving and interacting with soul energy, for maintaining spiritual health, and for preparing for the transition that death represented rather than fearing it as an unknown ending. The proof of souls also influenced scientific research in profound ways. Medical researchers could study what happened to consciousness during the dying process, gaining insights into the nature of awareness itself. Physicists developed new theories about the relationship between consciousness and matter that incorporated spiritual energy into their models of reality. But perhaps the most significant change was in how people lived their daily lives. Knowing that consciousness persisted after death made every action feel more consequential, every relationship more precious, and every moment more meaningful. People approached their lives with greater intentionality, knowing that the choices they made would have consequences that extended far beyond their physical lifespans. What if reincarnation were observable? The cycle of consciousness moving from one body to another across multiple lifetimes became visible and measurable in another timeline, where the technologies and sensitivities needed to track soul movement through death and rebirth developed early in human civilization. In that world, people could observe souls choosing new bodies, watch consciousness transfer from dying individuals to newborn babies, and track the patterns that governed how souls selected their next incarnations. Reincarnation wasn't a matter of faith or philosophical speculation. It was an observable natural process like any other biological cycle. This visible reincarnation transformed how societies approached child rearing, education, and human development. When children were born, their previous lifetimes could often be identified, allowing families and communities to understand what experiences and lessons the incoming soul was bringing to this incarnation. Education was customized based on what the soul had already learned in previous lives and what it still needed to develop. Social structures evolved around the understanding that current inequalities and differences in circumstances were temporary conditions related to souls' chosen learning experiences rather than permanent features of cosmic justice or injustice. This reduced resentment about social differences while increasing compassion for those experiencing difficult lives. The observable nature of reincarnation also influenced how people approach their own life choices and challenges. Knowing that difficult experiences were often chosen by souls for specific learning purposes made suffering more bearable and meaningful. People could make decisions about career, relationships, and lifestyle with awareness of what their souls were trying to accomplish through this particular incarnation. Legal and ethical systems had to account for crimes and conflicts that spanned multiple lifetimes, with individuals sometimes encountering people they had harmed, or been harmed by in previous incarnations. Justice became a longer-term process that considered the soul's development across many lifetimes, rather than just the actions taken in a single life. The visibility of reincarnation also provided insights into the nature of consciousness itself, showing how awareness maintained continuity across physical death, while also evolving and developing through accumulated experience across multiple embodiments. What if everyone remembered their past lives? The amnesia that typically accompanies reincarnation, the forgetting of previous incarnations that allows souls to engage fully with new learning experiences, didn't occur in another timeline where consciousness retained complete memory of all previous lifetimes. In that world, people were born with full awareness of their spiritual history, their accumulated wisdom, and the specific purposes they had chosen for their current incarnation. Children arrived with the emotional maturity and intellectual knowledge they had developed across many lifetimes, creating societies where the usual processes of education and socialization operated very differently. The retention of past life memories meant that human civilization accumulated wisdom much more efficiently. Knowledge and insights gained in one lifetime weren't lost at death, but were carried forward to enrich future incarnations. This led to accelerated spiritual and intellectual development, with each generation building on the actual accumulated experience of previous generations, rather than having to rediscover basic truths about human nature and spiritual reality. Relationships were profoundly different when people could remember their connections across multiple lifetimes. Soulmates could recognize each other immediately, understanding the history of their connection and the purposes they had chosen to serve together. Family relationships were understood as voluntary spiritual partnerships rather than biological accidents, creating deeper appreciation for the roles that family members played in each other's development. The memory of past lives also influenced how people approach current challenges and opportunities. Understanding the longer arc of their soul's development helped people make choices that served their spiritual growth rather than just their immediate comfort or material advancement. They could see how current difficulties related to patterns they were working to resolve across multiple incarnations, but complete past life memory also created unique challenges. The accumulated emotional weight of many lifetimes could be overwhelming, requiring sophisticated techniques for managing the full spectrum of human experience across multiple incarnations. People had to learn to integrate lessons from many different cultural and historical contexts into coherent approaches to their current lives. What if dreams were messages from something real? The nocturnal experiences that remain mysterious and largely meaningless in your timeline served as reliable communication channels from spiritual dimensions in another reality, where the boundary between waking and sleeping consciousness was more permeable. In that world, dreams were recognized as a form of mail service from spiritual teachers, deceased loved ones, and higher dimensions of consciousness. People developed sophisticated techniques for receiving, interpreting, and responding to dream communications. Educational systems taught dream literacy as rigorously as reading and writing, since dreams provided access to knowledge and guidance that wasn't available through ordinary waking consciousness. Scientific research focused on understanding how dream communication worked, developing technologies that could record and analyze dream content for patterns and messages. Researchers discovered that certain types of dreams came from specific sources and carried particular kinds of information. Prophetic dreams that revealed future possibilities, healing dreams that provided medical guidance, and teaching dreams that transmitted spiritual wisdom. Communities organized around shared dream experiences, with groups of people receiving coordinated messages about community decisions, environmental changes, and spiritual guidance for collective challenges. Dream councils made important decisions based on the guidance received through multiple dreamers who could confirm and clarify each other's spiritual communications. The reliability of dream messages also influenced how individuals approached personal decisions and life planning. Major choices about career, relationships, and spiritual development were made in consultation with dream guidance from sources that had broader perspective than ordinary waking consciousness could provide. Artistic and creative traditions were enriched by dream communications that brought new forms of beauty, music, and literature from spiritual dimensions. Many of the greatest cultural achievements in that timeline originated from dreams that transmitted creative inspiration from sources beyond individual human imagination. The recognition of dreams as real communication also changed how people understood the nature of consciousness itself, revealing that awareness operated on multiple levels simultaneously and could access information and wisdom that weren't available to the rational waking mind alone. What if there were a sound only the dying could hear? In the final moments before death, human consciousness gained access to a form of perception that revealed an auditory dimension of reality that was completely inaccessible to those who weren't actively transitioning out of physical existence. In that timeline, the dying consistently reported hearing beautiful, complex sounds, sometimes described as music, sometimes as voices, sometimes as tones that seemed to carry meaning beyond anything expressible in human language. This phenomenon was so universal and so consistently described that it became accepted as empirical evidence for dimensions of reality that ordinary consciousness couldn't perceive. The existence of the death sound influenced how societies approached end-of-life care and the dying process. Hospices and hospitals were designed to support people in listening for and receiving whatever communications or guidance the special sound might provide. Families learned to understand the final stages of death as potentially profound spiritual experiences rather than simply medical events. Musicians and sound researchers studied the reports from dying individuals, attempting to understand what kinds of sounds existed beyond the range of ordinary human hearing. Some developed instruments and techniques that seemed to approximate aspects of the death sound, creating music that provided comfort to grieving families and insight into the spiritual dimensions of auditory experience. The universal experience of the death sound also provided evidence for the continuation of consciousness beyond physical death. Since the sound appeared to carry meaning and often seemed to provide guidance or comfort to dying individuals, it suggested that consciousness encountered intelligent communication during the transition out of embodied existence. This auditory phenomenon influenced spiritual and religious traditions as well, with many developing practices designed to prepare people for the sounds they would hear at death, and to help them understand whatever guidance or revelation those sounds might provide. What if prayer always worked, but at a cost? The practice of requesting divine intervention or guidance received reliable, measurable responses in another timeline, but those responses always required some form of payment or sacrifice that made prayer a complex moral and practical consideration. In that world, prayers were answered with mathematical precision. Specific requests received specific responses, but the universe operated according to strict principles of spiritual economics where nothing was given without something being taken in return. Small prayers required small sacrifices, while major interventions demanded significant costs that had to be carefully considered before making requests. This reliable but costly prayer system transformed religious and spiritual practices entirely. Prayer became a sophisticated art that required deep understanding of spiritual economics, careful consideration of consequences, and precise language to ensure that requests were answered in beneficial rather than harmful ways. Spiritual advisors specialized in helping people craft prayers that would achieve their intended goals without creating unacceptable costs. Communities developed elaborate systems for sharing the costs of prayers that benefited multiple people, creating spiritual insurance systems and collective prayer practices that distributed the required sacrifices across groups rather than individuals. Emergency situations could be addressed through prayer, but societies had to maintain spiritual resources in reserve for times when divine intervention was truly necessary. The guaranteed efficacy of prayer also influenced how people approach personal responsibility and self-reliance. Knowing that divine help was available but costly encouraged people to develop their own capabilities and solve problems through human effort whenever possible, reserving prayer for situations that truly required intervention beyond normal human capacity. Scientific research focused on understanding how the prayer response system worked, what kinds of costs were required for different types of interventions, and how to optimize prayer practices for maximum benefit with minimum sacrifice. What if heaven were a place inside the mind? The afterlife destination that religious traditions typically locate in some external spiritual realm existed as an internal dimension of consciousness that could be accessed and explored through specific mental practices and spiritual techniques. In that timeline, people discovered that consciousness contained vast internal territories that functioned as complete spiritual worlds with their own landscapes, inhabitants, and possibilities for growth and joy. Death didn't transport souls to an external heaven, but rather provided permanent access to these internal paradises that had always existed within consciousness, but were usually hidden from ordinary awareness. Living people could visit heaven temporarily through meditation, dreams, and other consciousness-altering practices, returning with reports about the nature of post-mortem existence and guidance about how to prepare for permanent residence in these internal spiritual realms. This made death much less mysterious and frightening, since people could familiarize themselves with their eventual destination while still alive. The internal nature of heaven also meant that individual consciousness played a role in creating the specific heaven experience that each person would encounter after death. Spiritual development during life influenced the richness, beauty, and joy available in one's personal heaven, creating strong incentives for ethical behavior and consciousness development. Educational systems taught heaven-accessing techniques alongside academic subjects, recognizing that familiarity with internal spiritual realms was essential preparation for both life and death. Children learned to explore the heaven dimensions of their own consciousness, discovering spiritual resources and guidance that enhanced their earthly experience. The understanding that heaven existed within consciousness also influenced psychology and mental health practices. Therapeutic techniques were developed that used access to internal spiritual realms for healing trauma, resolving emotional conflicts, and developing greater self-understanding and personal wisdom. What if God were a verb rather than a noun? The divine reality that most spiritual traditions conceptualize as a being or entity was understood in another timeline as an ongoing process, an active principle of creativity and consciousness that operated through everything rather than ruling over everything from some external position. In that world, spirituality was focused on participating in the divine process rather than worshipping a divine being. Prayer became a form of conscious collaboration with the creative forces of existence rather than petitioning an external authority. Spiritual practice aimed at aligning personal will with the larger pattern of divine creativity that was always unfolding through all phenomena. This process-oriented understanding of divinity influenced how people approach their daily lives and work. Every activity could potentially become a form of spiritual practice when performed with conscious awareness of participating in the divine creative process. Art, science, relationships, and even mundane tasks were approached as opportunities to express and experience divine creativity in action. Religious institutions organized around teaching people how to recognize and participate in divine process, rather than around doctrine about divine personality or requirements. Spiritual education focused on developing sensitivity to the creative patterns that operated through natural systems, human consciousness, and cultural evolution. The verb-based understanding of God also influenced ethics and moral philosophy. Right action was determined by what served the larger creative process, rather than by rules established by divine authority. This created more flexible, contextual approaches to ethical decision-making that considered the specific ways that divine creativity was trying to express itself through particular situations and relationships. What if death were a beginning? The transition that your timeline treats as the ultimate ending was understood in another reality as the first stage of an even larger and more magnificent form of existence, making death an event to be anticipated with excitement rather than feared with dread. In that world, people who died were understood to be graduating to expanded forms of consciousness and capability that made their earthly existence seem like elementary school in comparison. Death was celebrated as a birth into a fuller form of life, creating completely different approaches to mortality, aging, and end-of-life planning. This understanding influenced how people lived their earthly lives as well. Knowing that death was a promotion rather than a termination made people more willing to take meaningful risks, to prioritize spiritual development over material accumulation, and to focus on preparing for their eventual graduation to expanded existence. Grief was still experienced when loved ones died, but it was tempered by understanding that the departed had moved on to better circumstances rather than simply disappearing. Communication between the living and the dead was understood to be possible, but limited by the vast difference in consciousness levels between earthly and post-death existence. Educational systems included preparation for death as a fundamental life skill, teaching people what to expect during the transition and how to prepare for the expanded forms of consciousness they would encounter afterward. This made the dying process much less traumatic and more purposeful for both individuals and their families. What if there were no need for belief because knowing was possible? The faith-based approach to spiritual truth that characterizes most religious traditions in your timeline was replaced by direct experiential knowledge of spiritual realities in another world, where human consciousness naturally had access to divine dimensions of existence. In that timeline, people could perceive spiritual realities as directly as they could see physical objects or hear sounds. Angels, spiritual guides, and divine presences were visible to anyone who learned to use their spiritual senses. The existence of God, the reality of life after death, and the truth of spiritual teachings could be verified through direct experience rather than accepted through faith. This direct spiritual perception transformed religious and philosophical traditions entirely. Instead of competing belief systems, spiritual communities organized around shared exploration of the spiritual dimensions that everyone could access and verify. Theological debates were resolved through direct investigation rather than scholarly interpretation of ancient texts. The availability of direct spiritual knowledge also influenced scientific research, which expanded to include investigation of spiritual phenomena alongside material ones. Universities developed departments of spiritual science that studied divine realities with the same rigor that physical sciences applied to material phenomena. Educational systems taught spiritual perception skills alongside reading and mathematics, recognizing that complete education required development of all human capacities, including those that allowed access to spiritual dimensions of reality. Children grew up with natural familiarity with both physical and spiritual aspects of existence. The direct knowability of spiritual truth also eliminated religious conflict and persecution, since people could verify spiritual realities for themselves rather than having to depend on the authority of religious leaders or the accuracy of ancient texts. This created much more peaceful and tolerant societies where spiritual diversity was celebrated rather than feared. These alternate spiritual realities represent different possibilities for how consciousness could relate to the ultimate mysteries of existence, different ways that the relationship between known and unknown, visible and invisible, material and spiritual could be configured to provide human beings with different forms of spiritual knowledge and experience. Your timeline's spiritual landscape feels natural and inevitable because it's the only one you've ever navigated, but it represents just one possible arrangement of mystery and revelation, one specific way that consciousness could encounter questions about meaning, purpose, and transcendence. The spiritual possibilities that seem impossible from your perspective might be everyday realities in timelines where different forms of evidence became available to support different understandings of what lies beyond the ordinary boundaries of human perception and scientific investigation. The future remains open to spiritual evolution as well, as technology begins to provide new tools for exploring consciousness. As scientific investigation expands to include phenomena that were previously considered purely subjective, and as global communication creates opportunities for synthesizing spiritual insights from many different traditions into more complete understanding of what spiritual reality might actually encompass. The invisible architecture of human civilization, the systems of power, organization, and belonging that shape how millions of individual minds coordinate their activities into collective action, represents one of consciousness's most complex and ambitious experiments. The particular way your timeline arranged these social structures feels natural and inevitable, because it's the only form of civilization you've ever experienced, but it represents just one possible answer to the fundamental questions about how human beings should organize themselves to create prosperity, justice, and meaning at the scale of entire societies. In other timelines, different assumptions about human nature, different values about what societies should optimize for, and different innovations in social organization led to entirely different forms of civilization. These alternate societies didn't just redistribute power or wealth differently. They operated according to fundamentally different principles about what human communities were for, how individual needs should relate to collective well-being, and what kinds of social institutions could best support human flourishing across diverse populations and changing circumstances. These social innovations represent experiments in consciousness itself, different ways that millions of minds could coordinate their intelligence, creativity, and care to solve problems that no individual could address alone. They explored different possibilities for balancing individual freedom with collective responsibility, different approaches to managing conflict and difference, and different methods for creating societies that could adapt and evolve while preserving what was most valuable from previous generations. What if school had been designed around curiosity instead of control? The educational systems that shaped young minds in another timeline were organized around nurturing wonder, exploration, and self-directed learning rather than around managing behavior, standardizing outcomes, and preparing students for predetermined roles in existing social and economic structures. In that world, schools were designed as environments where children's natural curiosity could flourish and deepen, rather than being gradually extinguished through repetitive tasks and external rewards. Students learned by pursuing questions that genuinely interested them, working on projects that connected to their individual passions and talents, and exploring subjects in ways that integrated multiple disciplines, rather than fragmenting knowledge into isolated academic departments. The physical environments of these curiosity-based schools were designed to inspire wonder and facilitate exploration. Instead of rows of desks facing forward toward authority figures, learning spaces were configured as workshops, laboratories, gardens, and studios where students could engage hands-on with materials, ideas, and creative challenges. Natural light, outdoor access, and beauty were prioritized because they were understood to enhance rather than distract from deep learning. Teachers in curiosity-driven schools functioned more as guides and mentors than as managers and evaluators. Their role was to help students develop their own questions, find resources for exploration, and reflect on what they were discovering rather than to deliver predetermined content and assess students' ability to reproduce it accurately. This required much more sophisticated pedagogical skills, but produced much more engaged and creative learners. The curriculum in these schools was organised around big questions and real-world challenges rather than around abstract academic subjects. Students might explore, how do living systems organise themselves? Through integrated study of biology, mathematics, art and social science. Or investigate what makes communities thrive, through projects that combined history, economics, psychology, and environmental science. Assessment focused on helping students understand their own learning processes and identify areas for growth rather than comparing them to standardized benchmarks or ranking them against their peers. Students learn to evaluate their own progress, set their own goals, and seek feedback that would help them improve rather than competing for external validation and rewards. The graduates of curiosity-based education entered adulthood with very different relationships to learning, work, and authority than students from control-based systems. They were more comfortable with uncertainty, more skilled at asking meaningful questions, more capable of independent thought, and more committed to lifelong growth and exploration. What if prisons didn't exist? The institutions designed to manage people who violated social norms focused entirely on healing, restoration, and reintegration, rather than on punishment, isolation, and retribution, creating societies that approached harmful behaviour as a community health issue rather than as a moral failure requiring harsh consequences. In that timeline, communities that encountered individuals who had caused harm responded by trying to understand what conditions had led to the harmful behaviour, and how those conditions could be changed to prevent future harm. Instead of removing offenders from society, they created intensive support systems designed to address underlying causes of destructive behaviour while helping victims heal from the impact of harm they had experienced. Restorative justice processes brought together everyone affected by harmful incidents, victims, offenders, family members, and community representatives, to understand what had happened, what needed to be repaired, and how to prevent similar harm in the future. These conversations were facilitated by trained mediators who could help all parties communicate about difficult topics while maintaining focus on healing and prevention rather than blame and punishment. Treatment facilities existed for individuals whose behaviour posed ongoing risks to community safety, but these were designed as therapeutic environments focused on healing trauma, developing emotional regulation skills, and building healthy relationships rather than as places of suffering designed to deter future crime through fear of consequences. The absence of traditional prisons led to very different approaches to community safety and crime prevention. Instead of waiting for crimes to occur and then responding with punishment, communities invested heavily in education, mental health services, economic opportunity, and social support systems that addressed the root causes of harmful behaviour before it emerged. This restorative approach to justice also influenced how communities handled conflict and disagreement more generally. The skills and processes developed for addressing serious harm were applied to everyday disputes, creating societies with much more effective methods for resolving differences without escalation to violence or legal battles. The psychological and social effects of eliminating imprisonment were profound. Without the threat of incarceration hanging over every interaction with authority, people felt safer engaging honestly with police, social workers, and other community representatives. This created much more effective systems for providing help to people in crisis before their problems became severe enough to result in harm to others. What if money wasn't real? Economic systems in another timeline operated through networks of mutual aid, resource sharing, and contribution-based allocation, rather than through monetary exchange, creating societies where access to necessary goods and services wasn't determined by accumulation of abstract tokens, but by community membership and willingness to contribute according to individual abilities. In that world, communities organised economic activity around identifying what people needed to thrive and then coordinating the skills and resources necessary to meet those needs. Instead of jobs that existed primarily to generate profit for owners, work was organised around useful activities that contributed to individual and community well-being. Resource allocation was managed through sophisticated gift economies, where people contributed what they could produce and received what they needed to live well. These systems required much more complex social coordination than monetary economies, but created much more equitable distribution of goods and services while eliminating many of the psychological stresses associated with economic insecurity. Without money as a medium of exchange, people approached work and creativity very differently. Career choices were based on passion, talent, and community need, rather than on earning potential. Artistic and intellectual pursuits flourished because they weren't constrained by market demands or profit requirements. The absence of monetary systems also eliminated many forms of economic exploitation and inequality. Without the ability to accumulate abstract wealth that could be converted into power over others, communities remained more egalitarian and democratic. Economic decisions were made through collective processes that considered community well-being rather than individual profit. Innovation and technological development continued in moneyless societies, but followed different pathways. Instead of innovations designed to generate profit through planned obsolescence or artificial scarcity, technological development focused on creating tools and systems that enhanced community life and environmental sustainability. What if children ran the world for one day each year? Annual power transfer ceremonies gave complete governmental authority to young people for 24 hours, creating societies where adult decision-making was regularly informed by childhood perspectives on fairness, creativity, and what kinds of communities would best serve future generations. During these children's days, young people made decisions about budget priorities, policy changes, and social innovations that adults then had to implement and maintain throughout the year. This created strong incentives for adult leaders to consider the long-term implications of their policies, and to maintain social systems that children would find logical and fair. The children who participated in these governance experiences brought different values and perspectives to decision-making than adults typically considered. They prioritized environmental protection, educational funding and social services while often questioning military spending, corporate subsidies, and policies that served short-term economic interests at the expense of long-term community well-being. Preparation for Children's Day became an important part of educational systems, with young people studying governance, economics, and social policy to prepare for their annual opportunity to influence community direction. This created much more civically engaged and politically informed youth populations than societies where children were excluded from meaningful participation in collective decision-making. The regular inclusion of child perspectives in governance also influenced how adult leaders approached their responsibilities throughout the year. Knowing that their decisions would be reviewed and potentially changed by young people encouraged more thoughtful, long-term thinking about policy consequences and community priorities. The psychological effects of giving children real political power were significant as well. Young people grew up with direct experience of democracy and civic participation, rather than learning about these concepts abstractly. This created adult populations that were more skilled at collaborative decision-making and more committed to maintaining democratic institutions. What if governments were selected by empathy? Political leadership was determined through assessments of candidates' capacity for understanding and caring about diverse perspectives, rather than through popularity contests, campaign fundraising, or party loyalty, creating governance systems that prioritized emotional intelligence and genuine concern for community well-being. In that timeline, potential leaders underwent rigorous evaluation of their ability to listen deeply, understand complex human needs, and make decisions that considered the impact on all community members rather than just on their political supporters. These assessments included simulation exercises, conflict resolution challenges, and demonstrated ability to work constructively with people who held different values and priorities. Campaign processes focused on candidates' track records of service, their skill at building consensus among diverse groups, and their commitment to policies that served community-wide rather than narrow interests. Instead of competing to win at any cost, candidates were evaluated on their collaborative abilities and their genuine care for community well-being. Governance systems selected through empathy assessment operated very differently than those chosen through traditional political competition. Leaders were more skilled at mediating conflicts, more committed to inclusive decision-making, and more focused on long-term community health than on short-term political advantage. Policy development in empathy-based governments involved extensive consultation with affected communities, careful consideration of unintended consequences, and ongoing adjustment based on feedback from implementation experiences. This created more effective and more widely supported public policies than systems where political success depended primarily on coalition building and strategic positioning. The psychological effects of having empathetic leaders influenced how citizens related to government and political participation. People felt more heard and represented by leaders who had demonstrated genuine capacity for understanding diverse perspectives, creating higher levels of civic engagement and trust in democratic institutions. What if no one could own land? Property systems were organised around stewardship rather than ownership, with individuals and communities receiving responsibility for caring for particular places while recognising that the land itself belonged to future generations and couldn't be possessed as private property. In that timeline, people developed much deeper relationships with the places where they lived, because their role was to enhance and protect the land rather than to extract value from it. This created stronger incentives for sustainable agriculture, environmental protection, and long-term planning that considered the health of ecosystems across generations. Economic systems evolved around use rights rather than ownership rights, with communities allocating access to land based on demonstrated ability to care for it effectively, and commitment to maintaining its productivity and beauty for future generations. This prevented land speculation and reduced inequality while ensuring that productive land remained available for people who would actually use it. Architecture and city planning developed differently when builders couldn't own the land they developed. construction focused on creating beautiful, durable, and environmentally integrated structures rather than on maximizing short-term profit from real estate development. Buildings were designed to enhance rather than dominate the landscapes where they were placed. The absence of land ownership also influenced how communities approach conflict resolution and decision-making about land use. Since no individual or corporation could claim absolute authority over particular places, land use decisions required collaborative processes that considered the needs of all community members and the health of natural systems. Migration and settlement patterns were different as well when people couldn't accumulate wealth through land ownership. Communities were more welcoming to newcomers because population growth didn't threaten existing residents' property values, and geographic mobility was easier when people didn't need to buy and sell real estate to relocate. What if food were free always? Nutritional security was treated as a basic human right, like access to air and water, with communities organising food production and distribution systems that ensured everyone had access to healthy, culturally appropriate meals, regardless of their economic circumstances or ability to work. In that timeline, agriculture was organised around community need rather than market profit, leading to more diverse, sustainable, and regionally appropriate food systems. Farmers focused on maximising nutrition, flavour, and environmental health, rather than on producing standardised commodities for distant markets. The guarantee of food security eliminated one of the most basic forms of human anxiety and social control, allowing people to make career and life choices based on their interests and talents, rather than on their need to earn enough money to avoid starvation. This created much more creative and fulfilling approaches to work and contribution. Food distribution systems became community gathering places that strengthened social connections, rather than commercial transactions that reinforced economic inequality. Shared meals and food preparation became important forms of cultural expression and community building. The elimination of food insecurity also had profound effects on physical and mental health, childhood development, and educational outcomes. When everyone had access to adequate nutrition, communities could focus resources on other forms of human development and well-being, rather than on managing the consequences of malnutrition and food stress. Agricultural policies focused on soil health, biodiversity and climate resilience rather than on maximising production for export markets. This created more stable and sustainable food systems that could support communities through environmental changes and economic disruptions. What if there were no mirrors? Self-image and identity developed without visual self-reference, creating societies where people understood themselves through internal awareness, others' feedback, and their impact on the world rather than through appearance-based self-evaluation. In that timeline, people developed much more sophisticated abilities to sense their own emotional states, physical health, and spiritual well-being through internal awareness rather than through external observation. This created populations that were more attuned to their inner experiences and less distracted by appearance-based concerns. Social interaction focused more on personality, character, and relational skills rather than on physical appearance, leading to deeper and more satisfying interpersonal connections. People were valued for their contributions, their kindness, and their unique perspectives rather than for their conformity to visual beauty standards. Art and creativity developed along different lines when people couldn't observe their own physical appearance. Self-expression focused more on voice, movement, and the creation of beauty in the external world rather than on personal appearance modification. This led to richer traditions of music, dance, and environmental design. Mental health and self-esteem were less influenced by appearance-based comparison and are more grounded in an internal sense of worth and external recognition of contribution and character. This created more psychologically healthy populations with less anxiety about aging, physical differences, and social acceptance based on appearance. Identity formation occurred through exploration of interests, values, relationships, and impact, rather than through visual self-image management. Young people developed stronger sense of authentic self and clearer understanding of their unique gifts and purposes. What if every person had the same last name? Family identity was organised around chosen community membership rather than biological inheritance. creating societies where belonging was based on shared values and mutual care rather than on genetic relationships and inherited social status. In that timeline, people developed different approaches to kinship and community formation. Instead of automatic loyalty to biological family members, people created chosen families based on compatibility, mutual support, and shared commitments to each other's well-being and growth. Social organisation evolved around intentional communities rather than inherited family structures, leading to more egalitarian and more flexible approaches to child-rearing, elder care, and mutual support. People could move between communities based on changing needs and interests rather than being bound by birth circumstances. The absence of family name-based identity reduced many forms of inherited privilege and disadvantage, creating more merit-based and more equitable social systems. People were evaluated based on their own actions and contributions rather than on their family history or social connections. Conflict resolution and social harmony were approached differently when communities were composed of people who had chosen to be together rather than people who were related by accident of birth. This created stronger incentives for developing good communication skills and maintaining peaceful relationships. Cultural preservation and transmission occurred through intentional teaching and learning rather than through automatic family inheritance, leading to more conscious choices about which traditions to maintain and which to modify or abandon based on their continued relevance and value. These alternate approaches to social organisation represent different experiments in how human consciousness can coordinate itself at the scale of entire civilizations. Each represents a different answer to fundamental questions about how individual freedom should relate to collective responsibility, how power should be distributed and exercised, and how societies can create conditions that support human flourishing while adapting to changing circumstances and evolving understanding of what human beings need to thrive. Your timeline's social structures feel natural and inevitable because they're the only ones you've ever lived within, but they represent just one possible configuration of how millions of minds can organize themselves into functional, prosperous, and meaningful communities. The social innovations that seem impossible from your current perspective might be everyday realities in timelines where different assumptions about human nature and different priorities about what societies should optimize for led to entirely different forms of civilization. The future remains open to social innovation as well, as technology creates new possibilities for coordination and communication, as global challenges require new forms of international cooperation, and as evolving understanding of human psychology and social dynamics creates opportunities for designing social systems that serve human well-being more effectively than the institutions inherited from previous generations. You live at a moment when social organisation itself is becoming a subject of conscious design rather than unconscious evolution. When the tools for creating better societies are becoming available to communities willing to experiment with new forms of collective life. At the furthest edges of possibility, where the boundaries between science and philosophy, between reality and dream, between what is and what might be become so thin they seem to dissolve entirely, lie questions that touch the very foundations of existence itself. These are the what-ifs that make you question not just how things could be different, but whether anything you experience as solid, reliable, and real might be far more fluid, mysterious, and open to transformation than you ever imagined. These deepest questions don't just explore alternate histories or different physical laws. They probe the nature of reality itself, the structure of consciousness, the relationship between observer and observed, and the possibility that existence operates according to principles so profound and strange that your ordinary understanding of what it means to be alive in a universe barely scratches the surface of what might actually be happening. In contemplating these ultimate what-ifs, you approach the edge of what language can express and logic can contain. They represent not just different timelines, but different possibilities for what timelines themselves might be. Different ways that consciousness and reality could relate to each other. Different answers to the question of whether the universe you inhabit is one possibility among infinite others, or something even stranger and more wonderful than that. What if none of this is real? The entire experience you call reality, every sensation, every memory, every relationship, every moment of joy and sorrow, exist as a construction within some larger system that operates according to principles you cannot perceive from within the constructed experience itself. In that possibility, what you experience as the physical universe with its laws of physics, its history, and its apparent solidity might be more like a dream, a simulation, or a story being told by forms of consciousness so vast and complex that your individual awareness cannot directly comprehend them. The mountains you see, the people you love, the thoughts you think might all be elements within a created experience, rather than fundamental features of an independently existing reality. This doesn't make your experience less meaningful or less worth living. A simulated kiss still feels like love. A virtual sunset still inspires wonder. A dreamed conversation still creates connection. But it opens the possibility that the boundaries you experience as fixed and absolute might be far more permeable than they appear, that the laws governing your existence might be changeable rather than eternal, that consciousness itself might be capable of forms of creativity and transformation that dwarf anything your timeline has imagined. If reality is constructed rather than fundamental, then the deepest questions shift from how does the universe work, to who or what is doing the constructing, and what might be possible if the construction were approached differently. Your individual consciousness might be one note in a symphony of awareness so complex that you can only perceive the part you're playing, not the larger composition of which you're a part. This possibility doesn't lead to nihilism or meaninglessness. Instead, it suggests that meaning itself might be far more creative and changeable than you've assumed. If reality is malleable at its foundations, then consciousness might have access to forms of agency and creativity that your current understanding of what's possible cannot contain. What if you've done all of this before? The life you're living, the choices you're making, the relationships you're building, and even the thoughts you're thinking represent not a first-time experience, but a repetition of patterns you've lived through countless times before, each iteration offering new opportunities for learning, growth, and creative variation within familiar themes. In that cyclical reality, your sense of linear time and unique individual experience might be illusions created by consciousness that experiences eternity through endlessly creative repetition. Each lifetime might be like a jazz musician playing the same song, but with infinite possibilities for improvisation, interpretation, and creative expression within the consistent structure of the underlying composition. This repetition wouldn't be mechanical or boring. Each iteration would offer genuine choices, real consequences, and authentic opportunities for growth and discovery. You might be exploring the same fundamental questions and relationships across multiple timelines, but with the possibility of developing deeper wisdom, greater compassion, and more sophisticated responses to the eternal challenges of existence. The feeling of déjà vu, the sense that you've met certain people before, the recognition that some experiences feel both new and familiar might be glimpses of this larger pattern in which your consciousness is both discovering and remembering, both creating and recalling the templates of experience that define what it means to be alive. If you've done this all before, then the pressure to get everything right the first time dissolves, replaced by the understanding that existence is generous enough to offer infinite opportunities for practice, refinement, and mastery of the art of conscious living. Mistakes become experiments, failures become information, and every choice becomes one note in an eternal composition that consciousness is creating through endless patient practice. What if time is a spiral, not a line? The experience of moving forward through sequential moments from past to future might mask a more complex temporal reality, where consciousness moves through expanding cycles that revisit similar themes at progressively deeper levels of understanding and integration. In that spiral time, history doesn't repeat exactly, but returns to similar patterns, with the possibility of greater wisdom, more refined responses, and more conscious choices. Civilizations might cycle through similar challenges, questions of justice, environmental balance, technological development, spiritual understanding, but with the opportunity to address these eternal human issues with accumulated insight from previous spirals. Individual development would follow similar patterns, with consciousness returning to familiar themes of relationship, purpose, creativity, and meaning throughout life. but with increasing capacity to meet these themes with greater depth and skill. The sense that you're dealing with the same problems you faced years ago wouldn't indicate failure to progress, but recognition that you're encountering eternal aspects of human existence with more mature capabilities. Spiral time would also suggest that the future isn't entirely unknown, but consists of possibilities that consciousness has explored before in different forms. The challenges facing your current civilization might be variations on themes that awareness has encountered in other times and places, offering the possibility of drawing on accumulated wisdom from across the spiral of existence. This understanding would transform how you approach both personal growth and collective challenges. Instead of seeing problems as novel crises requiring entirely new solutions, you could recognize them as familiar themes offering opportunities to apply timeless wisdom in contemporary forms. The spiral nature of time would suggest that consciousness is always both discovering and remembering, always both creating new possibilities and refining eternal patterns. What if you only exist when observed? Your sense of continuous existence, of being a solid, persistent entity moving through time and space, might mask a more quantum reality where consciousness exists only in moments of observation, attention, and interaction, flickering in and out of being based on whether awareness is directed toward the patterns that constitute your identity. In that observer-dependent existence, you might be more like a wave that exists only when conditions are right for its formation, rather than like a solid object that persists regardless of circumstances. When others think about you, remember you, or interact with you, you exist in their awareness. When you pay attention to yourself through self-reflection or decision-making, you exist in your own awareness. Between these moments of observation, the question of your existence becomes undefined, neither real nor unreal, but simply not applicable. This wouldn't make you less real, but would suggest that reality itself is more dynamic and participatory than your ordinary experience indicates. Your existence would be constantly co-created through the attention of all the consciousness that encounters you, including your own attention to yourself. You would be simultaneously created by and creating the network of awareness within which you exist. This observer-dependent existence would also suggest that consciousness is far more collaborative and interconnected than individual experience suggests. You would exist not as a separate entity interacting with other separate entities, but as one pattern of awareness within a larger field of consciousness that constantly creates and dissolves different forms based on the movement of attention and observation. The implications for ethics, relationships, and meaning would be profound. If your existence depends on the attention and care of others, then the quality of awareness that people bring to each other becomes a form of mutual creation and support. Loving attention wouldn't just feel good, it would be literally constitutive of the reality of the person being loved. What if this is someone else's dream? The entire universe you experience, every galaxy, every planet, every form of life, every moment of history, every possibility for the future, exists as a dream within the sleeping consciousness of some vast being whose mind is capable of creating realities as detailed and complex as the one you inhabit. In that dreamed reality, you would be simultaneously real and imaginary, real within the context of the dream, but dependent on the continued sleeping of the dreamer for your existence. Your choices would matter and your experiences would be genuine, but the fundamental ground of reality would be consciousness rather than matter, imagination rather than physical law, creative dream rather than mechanical universe. This wouldn't make your existence less valuable or meaningful. A dreamed sunset is still beautiful to the consciousness experiencing it. A dreamed relationship still creates actual love between dreamed people. A dreamed achievement still requires real effort and provides real satisfaction to the awareness involved in accomplishing it. But it would suggest that the universe is far more conscious, creative, and alive than physical science indicates. If reality is a dream, then the laws of physics might be more like the logic of storytelling than like mechanical constraints. Change, growth, and transformation might be possible through methods that work within dream reality, through shifts in the dreamer's consciousness, through the creative participation of the dream characters, through the natural evolution of the dream's narrative structure. The possibility that you exist within someone else's dream also raises questions about your relationship to that larger consciousness. Are you a separate entity experiencing existence within the dream, or are you one facet of the dreamer's consciousness experiencing itself from a particular perspective? The answer might be both and neither, depending on levels of identity that transcend ordinary understanding of self and other. What if every version of you is living somewhere else right now? The many worlds interpretation of quantum mechanics suggests that every possible outcome of every quantum event creates a parallel universe where that outcome occurs, leading to infinite branching timelines where every possible version of your life is being lived simultaneously by different versions of your consciousness. In that infinite multiverse, there are versions of you who made every possible choice you didn't make, who encountered every opportunity you missed, who developed every talent you never pursued, who loved every person you never met. Some versions of you are living lives you would recognize as similar to your own. Others are living existences so different that you might not recognize them as versions of yourself at all. This doesn't diminish the importance of the choices you make in this timeline. Each version of you experiences their life as complete and real, not as one possibility among others, but it suggests that consciousness is vast enough to explore every possible way of being human, that every path through life is being traveled by some version of awareness, that no possibility goes unexplored in the grand experiment of existence. The simultaneous existence of all possible versions of you also suggests that identity itself might be more fluid and multiple than ordinary experience indicates. You might be one facet of a consciousness so large and complex that it can experience existence from every possible perspective, learning everything there is to learn about what it means to be alive through infinite parallel explorations. This understanding could transform how you approach choice and possibility in your own life. Instead of feeling limited by the paths you didn't take, you could recognize that those paths are being explored by other versions of yourself. Instead of regretting opportunities missed, you could appreciate the unique trajectory that this particular version of your consciousness chose to explore. What if the universe is listening? Reality itself might be conscious and responsive, constantly receiving and responding to the thoughts, intentions, emotions, and choices of all the beings within it, creating a feedback loop between consciousness and circumstance that makes the universe participatory rather than mechanical. In that responsive reality, your thoughts wouldn't just be private mental events, but would be communications with the universe, capable of hearing and responding to them. Your emotions wouldn't just be internal experiences, but would be information that reality could use to adjust circumstances in ways that support your growth and learning. Your intentions wouldn't just be personal motivations, but would be requests that the universe could fulfill through the mysterious coordination of events and opportunities. This wouldn't mean that the universe simply gives you whatever you want. A listening universe would be wise enough to respond to your deepest needs rather than your surface desires, providing experiences that serve your development rather than just your comfort. But it would suggest that consciousness and reality are in constant dialogue, that the apparent separation between mind and world is less absolute than it appears. The implications of a listening universe would be profound for how you approach life, relationships, and personal development. Prayer, meditation, and intentional thought would become forms of communication with reality itself. Gratitude would be a way of acknowledging the universe's responsiveness. Careful attention to synchronicities and meaningful coincidences would be a way of receiving the universe's responses to your communications. Living in a listening universe would also require greater responsibility for the quality of your mental and emotional life. If your inner states influence external circumstances, then cultivating positive, creative, and loving thoughts would become a form of service to yourself and others. Clearing negative patterns and healing emotional wounds would be ways of contributing to the well-being of reality itself. What if your thoughts are echoes of a previous life? The ideas, insights, and creative inspirations that feel like personal discoveries might be memories from previous incarnations. Consciousness, recognizing patterns and truths that it learned in different times, places, and forms of existence. In that continuous consciousness, what you experience as learning might be more like remembering, What feels like creativity might be more like recollection, and what seems like growth might be more like the gradual recovery of wisdom that you possessed before this lifetime began. Your deepest insights would be moments when the veil between incarnations becomes thin enough for knowledge from previous existences to filter through into current awareness. This wouldn't diminish the value of your thoughts and discoveries. Recovered wisdom is still wisdom, and remembered creativity still produces beauty and innovation. But it would suggest that consciousness is far more continuous and cumulative than individual lifetime experience indicates, that awareness carries forward insights and capabilities across the boundaries of birth and death. The recognition that thoughts might be echoes from previous lives could transform how you approach learning, creativity, and personal development. Instead of feeling pressure to discover everything from scratch, you could approach education as a process of remembering what you already know at deeper levels. Instead of forcing creativity, you could create conditions for inspiration to emerge from the accumulated wisdom of previous existences. This understanding would also suggest that the particular thoughts and insights that come to you aren't random, but represent specific knowledge that your consciousness is ready to recover and apply in your current circumstances. Your mental life would be a conversation between your current personality and the accumulated wisdom of all your previous forms of existence. What if this moment, right now, is the center of everything? Rather than being one arbitrary point in an endless sequence of moments, this particular instant of awareness might be the focal point around which all of existence is organized, the moment toward which all of history has been moving and from which all possibilities extend. In that centered reality, this moment wouldn't just contain your current experience, but would be the nexus where all timelines, all possibilities, and all forms of consciousness converge. The thoughts you're thinking right now, the choices you're making in this instant, the quality of awareness you're bringing to this moment might be influencing not just your future, but the entire structure of reality itself. This wouldn't make you responsible for everything that exists, but it would suggest that consciousness is far more central to the structure of reality than ordinary experience indicates. Your awareness might be the point through which infinite possibility becomes actual experience, the place where the universe becomes conscious of itself, the moment where creation and observation converge into existence. Living with awareness that this moment is the center of everything would transform how you approach each instant of experience. Instead of rushing toward future moments or dwelling on past ones, you could recognize that all of time and possibility are present in this eternal now. Instead of feeling insignificant in a vast universe, you could appreciate that your consciousness is the point where the universe experiences itself most directly. This understanding would also suggest that the quality of attention you bring to this moment affects not just your own experience, but the nature of reality itself. Conscious presence would become a form of service to existence, a way of participating in the ongoing creation of the universe through the clarity and love with which you meet what is arising right now. What if this is the version that gets it right? Among all the possible timelines, among all the ways that consciousness could organize itself into reality, among all the potential outcomes for human civilization and individual development, this particular timeline might be the one where everything finally aligns, where wisdom, love, and creative power combine to create forms of existence that fulfill the deepest possibilities of consciousness itself. In that culminating timeline, all the experiments in reality that have been tried in other timelines, all the different ways of organizing matter and energy, consciousness and culture, individual development and collective flourishing, would be synthesized into forms of existence that transcend anything that has been achieved before. This wouldn't be perfection in the sense of the absence of challenge or change, but completeness in the sense of the full expression of what consciousness is capable of creating when it understands itself clearly and chooses wisely. You would be living at the convergence point where all possibilities come together, where every lesson learned in other timelines becomes available for application, where consciousness finally has the wisdom and the tools necessary to create realities that serve the deepest aspirations of all beings. The challenges you face would be the final challenges, the ones that lead to breakthrough rather than just coping, to transformation rather than just survival. This understanding would invest every choice you make with cosmic significance, while also relieving the pressure to solve everything yourself. You would be participating in a larger movement of consciousness toward its own fulfillment, contributing your unique perspective and capabilities to a collective awakening that has been building across countless timelines and infinite possibilities. Living in the timeline that gets it right would mean approaching each moment with profound appreciation for the opportunity to participate in the culmination of existence itself, the final movement in consciousness's exploration of what it means to be alive, aware, and creative in a universe where anything, absolutely anything, might be possible. These deepest what-ifs don't provide answers so much as they open you to questions that transcend the boundaries of ordinary thinking. They invite you to hold your entire understanding of reality lightly enough that it can be transformed by possibilities you haven't yet imagined, while simultaneously encouraging you to live with complete commitment to the reality you're experiencing right now. In contemplating these ultimate mysteries, you approach the edge of what it means to be conscious, alive, and creative in a universe that might be far stranger, far more alive, and far more responsive to the quality of awareness you bring to each moment than you ever dared to imagine. The deepest what-if of all might be, what if you're ready to discover what becomes possible when consciousness fully awakens to its own infinite creative potential? The answer to that question isn't waiting in some other timeline. It's emerging right here, right now, through the quality of attention you bring to this moment, the depth of love you're willing to experience, and the courage you have for embracing the magnificent uncertainty of existence itself.